Cheek? Was the primordial demoness also a man in the past? Klein almost raised his hand to his chin. He had once guessed that it was because of the existence of the evil goddess, the primordial demoness, that led to the assassin pathway having members of the opposite sex turn into a female after sequence 7. Who knew that Russell's diary would indicate that the primordial demoness might have been a male in the beginning as well? This depicted two problems. First, the primordial demoness wasn't a naturally born deity, and they had only relied on potions to reach sequence 0. Second, the purely feminine changes in this pathway were inherent in its Beyander characteristics. Russell had once speculated about the truth behind the law of Beyander characteristics conservation. He suspected that all Beyander characteristics originated from the original creator, so there's no increase, and that the total amount is conserved. Assuming that this is true, does this mean that the creator who created everything is all-inclusive, masculinity, femininity, and gender-neutral all in one? And the demoness pathway is a representation of pure femininity? Of course, that ancient book might actually be fake. There's a lot of information in Russell's diary entries today. With thoughts flashing through his mind, Klein let the diary disappear in his hands. You can begin, he smiled and said to Justice, the Sun, and the others. Alger looked towards the world immediately. Your werewolf characteristic has been sold. An artisan paid £1,200 for it. According to our agreement, I will receive £200. Also, I found clues to the hair of a deep-sea naga. £100 a strand, and you want 5 of them in total. If you're fine with this deal, then I will complete it as soon as possible. Klein had promised a higher share of the werewolf's Beyander characteristic because he knew that the hanged man had spent more effort and taken on a risk that far exceeded what vampire Emlyn White had spent. At this point, he thought for a moment and controlled the world to reply. No problem. Give me the 5 strands of deep-sea naga hairs and £500 in cash as soon as possible. Now, only the human skin shadow characteristic remains, and the amount of money I have has increased to £1,235, which isn't enough. If I don't want to wait for the machinery hivemind's exploration of the Aemon family's mausoleum, I'd have to wait to receive another £500 to £1,000 before I can buy it immediately when I see it. Klein subconsciously wondered what other items or knowledge he could use to exchange for money. Of course, this was on the premise that the target of these transactions was able to pay the remuneration, in cash. Hearing this, Audrey raised her hand very slightly, and without hiding anything, she said, I'd like to purchase 3 ingredients. A pair of eyes from a mirror dragon, 50 milliliters of its blood, as well as a fruit from the Tree of Elders. Miss Justice has gotten the formula for the psychiatrist potion. Klein made this judgment in an instant, and the hanged man came to a similar conclusion. I will write to my teacher and ask him if he has one of these ingredients. Furs thought for a moment. Derek nodded and said, I'll also take note. Corroded mirror dragons aren't rare, same for the Tree of Elders. In the City of Silver, there's also the Beyander characteristic left behind by a psyche analyst. However, it's hard to make transactions for them, and it's easy to be suspected. Psyche analyst was the ancient name of psychiatrist. When their conversation reached Klein's ears, he immediately manipulated the world and made the dummy hoarsely and gloomily say, I'll ask around in my circle. Oh right, continue helping me find the human skin shadow characteristic. All right. Audrey confidently turned her head to face the person opposite her. Mr. Hanged Man, I'll also look out for the wind-blessed potion formula you need. She had already joined the psychology alchemists and had a secret organization backing her. With them, many ingredients were no longer in short supply. She could obtain them as long as she paid the necessary price. Furs repeated, I'll write to my teacher and ask. Upon seeing this development, Klein felt rather gratified. After a long period of hard work, the Tarot Club had finally developed 2 major channels, the Psychology Alchemists and the Abraham family. Many things would become simple. The world chuckled and said, Your answers fill me with hope, but you must also take care to protect yourselves, and proceed in a way that would avoid arousing suspicion as much as possible. Mr. World, you rarely talk so much. Audrey smiled in reply. I got a little too pleased and momentarily forgot the world's original character profile. Klein immediately remedied the situation and made the world chuckle and say, all of you have become sufficiently valuable. I hope that this kind of transaction can last for a very, very long time. That's why I'm reminding you. Thank you. Audrey gracefully expressed her gratitude. At that moment, Derek hesitated and said, I'll give it a try as well. I've recently completed several patrol missions, but there's nothing out of the ordinary. Very good. Klein said to himself, making the world shut his mouth. After a brief moment of silence, Alger looked thoughtfully at Miss Justice. I would like to know the details of the assassination of Duke Negan. What kind of reward do you need? Why ask me? As someone close to the Church of the Lord of Storms, shouldn't you already know the full details of this case? Audrey was surprised for a moment, but then she understood the meaning of Mr. Hanged Man's words. He wants to ask about the organization or force that instigated the Desire Apostle, but he doesn't think it's right to ask the fool directly, thinking that it would be too sudden and invasive. So he took a roundabout way by asking me to open up the topic, gently shifting the focus to the things he wants to know. He knows that I'm a noble lady and that I should pay attention to the assassination of Duke Negan. So he's not worried that I won't answer him. Mr. Hanged Man is really experienced. Audrey said, with the corners of her mouth curling up slightly. No, there's no need for compensation. Isn't it the purpose of our tarot club to freely exchange common knowledge amongst each other regarding their respective regions? Only by doing so can our tarot club expand at a rapid pace. She thought to herself, quite possessively. Your words shame me. Alger was stunned for a moment before he pressed his hand to his chest and leaned forward a little. Klein, who was shrouded in the thick grey fog, inwardly laughed dryly. Audrey lightly pursed her lips, weighed her words, and said, the Desire Apostle used a unique situation to complete the assassination of Duke Negan. By using his ability to trigger intense emotions and desires, and at the cost of serious injuries, he successfully broke out of the encirclement, entering the sewers. When the Nighthawks caught up to him, he was already dead. The hero bandit Dark Emperor was present. This gentleman didn't do it to silence him, but to target the organization that entrusted the assassination contract to the Desire Apostle. Which organization? Just as the Hanged Man was wondering to himself in puzzlement, the fool, who was sitting at the end of the table, silently praised Miss Justice and looked at her. He then gave her a reminder in passing, in the outside world, do not mention the name of the organization or write it down. Why? Audrey blurted out in astonishment. Klein leaned back in his chair and replied in a gentle voice, any mention of it will be known. Any mention of it will be known. Audrey subconsciously looked at Mr. Fool, only to feel that he seemed to be emphasizing something with his eyes hidden in the fog. Mr. Fool is implying that if it's not in his kingdom or through talking to him, mentioning or writing down the name of the Twilight Hermit Order would allow them to sense it via some means or item. That should be what he means. What an extremely secretive and high-level organization. To a certain extent, it's even more terrifying than the Church of the Seven Deities. And Mr. Fool, our tarot club is looking for them. Audrey instantly felt like she understood a lot of things. She straightened her back and said, as you command. Any mention of it will be known. A secret organization whose name can't even be mentioned? A powerful organization that I don't know of at all? Is this the faction behind the Desire Apostle? Mr. Fool had sent his adorer to search for them? This high-level situation in the world really is more complicated than I thought. There are even more secrets that I have no way of knowing. Alger slightly nodded his head, feeling both shocked and agitated at the same time. At this moment, he had the urge to pay Mr. Fool for the name of the organization. However, after thinking about it carefully, he felt that there was no need for that. Although understanding the situation involving the higher-level entities would help him perfect his plans for the future and play an important role in certain situations, he, who was currently at the bottom of the mid-sequence levels, had no way of making contact with matters related to the mysterious organization. What he needed the most right now was the formula and ingredients for Windblessed, so he had to save up enough wealth for them. After succeeding my advancement, I could seek an opportunity to consult Mr. Fool. Alger made a note of this. Furs was confused by what she heard. Things like the Desire Apostle and the organization in which, any mention of it will be known, were completely different from what she had read in the newspapers. There are indeed many secrets behind the assassination of a duke. It's a pity that the organization's name cannot be written down. Otherwise, I can use it as the villain of a future novel. It will definitely be a classic. I still owe 10 diary pages and haven't bought the Spirit Eater's stomach pouch. There's no need to spend the money in order to understand such high-end matters for the time being. Well, the secrecy and knowledge circulating in the Tarot Club are 10 times greater than Mr. A's gathering, or more. Furs restrained her curiosity as a writer. As for Derek, he didn't know who Duke Negan was, so he didn't care who was behind the assassination. He sat silently and was reserved, as though he were in class. When the matter regarding the Twilight Hermit Order was over, Furs looked around and probingly asked, Lady and gentlemen, do you have a way to solve the problem of accumulating too many Beyonder characteristics of the same level? Alger looked at Furs and returned with a question. You were forced to drink a second apprentice potion? Why did you figure it out so easily? It's as though you were there to see it. Furs uncomfortably cleared her throat and said, yes, let's just pretend that's what happened. What solutions do you have? What do you need me to exchange for it? Alger glanced at Mr. Fool, but seeing that he had nothing to say, he replied in a calm and low voice, you don't need payment, because it will certainly not be able to satisfy your needs. Without waiting for Miss Magician and Miss Justice to ask, he casually explained, high-sequence Beyonders can independently decide whether or not to pass on their Beyonder characteristics to their descendants, and how much they will inherit as a result. Sequence 6 and Sequence 5 will naturally pass a part of it in an uncontrollable manner. Although the quantity isn't a lot each time and wouldn't affect the Beyonder's strength, their sequence will regress if they have enough children. Such a child is born with high spiritual perception and a certain level of incomplete Beyonder powers? Audrey suddenly came to a realization, understanding the origins of some special people. The Hanged Man nodded. Yes, they're equivalent to half a Sequence 9, with a certain amount of characteristics. If they want to become a Beyonder, they can only choose the corresponding path. Of course, such people might not be a result of inheritance. It might be the result of them gaining the blessings of a deity or the corruption of an evil spirit. There are many factors that can cause the same degree of influence. Also, when high-sequence Beyonders have children, they might give birth to someone who's already at Sequence 5. This is one of the rare instances when one can advance without losing control. So that's how it is. Audrey sighed with satisfaction. To her, knowing more mysteries was more enjoyable than getting a nice dress or jewelry. Furs also came to a realization as she pressed, then what about Beyonders at Sequence 7, 8, and 9? Theoretically speaking, their Beyonder characteristics will not be passed down to their descendants, but that is not absolute. If there's an excessive amount of Beyonder characteristics, there's a chance for them to be passed down as well. That is to say, if you're pregnant with a child, there's a way to effectively reduce the remnant potion in your body. No, one might not succeed, but 3 or 4 will stand a higher chance. 3 or 4. Furs stared agape. Klein, who had learned all of this general knowledge from Russell's diary, couldn't help but think of a joke. Miss Magician, in the future, you can say to your child that, you were a free gift less than sup greater than 1 less than, sup greater than from drinking a potion. Although it seems that, according to Mr. Hanged Man, the burden can be reduced the moment a child is conceived, having a child would still require almost 40 weeks of trouble. No, more than that, it's impossible to leave the child after it's born, right? After grasping the acting method, even if the process subsequently becomes more difficult, 2 months will definitely be enough time to digest it. It might not even take that long. After all, it's just a starting sequence. Furs forced a smile and said, I understand, the best way is still to rely on acting to digest it. Alger gave an affirmative answer. That's the case for Sequence 7 and below. After that, digestion would easily take a year or so, 2 to 3 years, and then 5 to 6 years. When that happens, giving birth to a child would be a simpler plan, he added inwardly. There were a few seconds of silence as the two women digested the knowledge they had just gained. This was the first time they had known that having a child had such uses. For Derek, this was common knowledge. He adjusted his posture and said, I've been assigned another exploration mission. Where to? Alger tilted his head and asked. It's still the half-destroyed temple of the fallen creator, Derek answered without sounding too grave. It sounds like there's a certain guaranteed level of safety. Audrey didn't interrupt. The Hanged Man pondered for 2 seconds before asking, is the Shepherd Elder still in prison? Yes. This exploration will be led by the chief. The Sun didn't hide the facts. This way, the danger level will be much lower than last time. You can give it a try. Alger couldn't help but look at Mr. Fool once more. Unable to read any thoughts from the other party's blurry eyes, he continued to speak to the Sun. This should be your last inspection before the surveillance is completely removed. Previously, the information you made known was that Aemon is archenemies with the fallen creator. They wouldn't mind exposing themselves to spoil the other's plans. This time, by heading to the fallen creator's temple for exploration, as long as you don't reveal any abnormalities, the 6-member council will basically determine that you're no longer under Amon's influence. Mr. Hanged Man sure is experienced. It's as if he was planning the operation. Derek kept it in mind before asking, what else do I need to pay attention to? At the very end of the long bronze table, the Fool, who was quietly watching, opened his mouth. Flesh and blood, ravings. Klein had only said 2 words, leaving the Tarot Club members to comprehend them on their own. This was the demeanor of a great figure. The Hanged Man pondered for a few seconds, then he said to the son who had thanked the fool, in particular, "Don't look at what you shouldn't, don't listen to what you shouldn't, don't eat what you shouldn't, and don't touch what you shouldn't." "What are those that shouldn't be seen or heard?" Derek asked, puzzled. The Hanged Man said with a deepened voice, after entering the temple, "Everything is included." "Then, how should I explore?" Derek asked in surprise. The Hanged Man chuckled. "Aren't there other members? Isn't there a chief? It really is Mr. Hanged Man style." Audrey subconsciously wanted to cover her face with her hands, but the education and habits ingrained in her had told her that such actions weren't graceful, so she forcefully changed the way she moved, stroking her drooping hair and pushing it behind her ears. The son felt that such a method was quite unacceptable. Upon noticing his reaction, Alger secretly cursed before saying, "What I mean is to listen to your chief's instructions. Only do what he allows you to do. At any other times, do not take matters into your own hands." "I understand. Thank you, Mr. Hanged Man." The son instantly relaxed. "Phew." Alger exhaled and turned to the woman opposite him. "Miss Justice, I wish to know the political changes in Backland after Duke Negan's passing." Audrey recalled the information she had heard, both directly and indirectly in recent times. Duke Negan's death has divided the House of Lords. Although his eldest son is about to inherit the nobility title and become a member of the House of Lords, his prestige isn't enough to calm the dispute. Nearly 10 members of the House of Lords have jointly proposed that the newly conferred nobility should also have a chance to obtain a fixed seat as a member of Parliament. Simply put, let those who are conferred nobility through political donations, charity donations, and the purchase of land become members of the House of Lords. Hearing this, the Hanged Man Alger laughed. Aren't nobles with a certain amount of history in their family line the ones who despise such people who rely on unorthodox means to be conferred a nobility title the most? Wasn't the ultimate honor and their greatest pride the fact that a fixed seat in the House of Lords was hereditary? Ignoring the inadvertent mockery, Audrey calmly explained, "When you have tens of thousands of pounds, hundreds of thousands of pounds, or even more debts, you will also make the same choice." Owing money wasn't a fatal threat to many nobles, but the debtor could apply to the court and use their lands as payment for the debts. Without the minimum amount of land needed for a noble title, their status as nobles would be on the verge of collapse. And then? Alger didn't continue to harp over the previous question. Audrey gave a rough description. This kind of dispute has put many bills on hold, including, but not limited to, the raising of worker salary, the improvement of working hours, and revising the poor law. It's gratifying to see that the Civil Servant Unified Examination is still progressing steadily and hasn't stopped, and the investigation into the air pollution in Backland is also going in depth. There will be no war for the time being, the Hanged Man whispered, and he went on to talk to the other members. Worried that staying too long in the bathroom would arouse suspicion, Klein announced the end of the tarot gathering after they were done. After returning to her room, Audrey didn't rush to get up. She first quietly sorted out the things she needed to do after this. Looking at the mirror in front of her, she played with the accessories on her earlobes. With a slight smile, she silently muttered to herself, "There will be a psychology lesson tomorrow afternoon. I can tell Miss Escalante that I've met someone in a Beander circle who's looking to buy the human skin shadow characteristic and has promised an abnormally generous price for it. I wonder if the psychology alchemists will be interested in it or not. Also, I mustn't forget Rissel's diary and the wind-blessed formula. Yes, I have to find the psychiatrist ingredients as quickly as possible. Audrey, you can't be lazy. Susie is already a sequence 8, so you can't let her overtake you." After pacing back and forth in the room, Furs finally made up her mind and pulled out her chair. She grabbed a piece of paper and a pen and, after mulling over it for nearly a minute, began to write to Dorian Gray. She described how she learned of someone who requested the characteristic of a human skin shadow and the wind-blessed potion formula, as well as her curiosity over the Rissell notebook. Ellipsis. The capital of the Rorstad archipelago, the city of generosity. Alger Wilson walked out of the hotel and headed for a secret underground market. His target was the hair of a deep-sea naga. He had no intention of missing a human skin shadow if someone had it. "I'm short on money." Klein sat in the living room and sighed again. He still needed quite a bit of cash to ensure that he could purchase the items directly when he received clues regarding the human skin shadow's characteristics. Klein thought for a long time, wondering if he should find other channels to sell the Beander characteristic left by the interrogator and stop waiting for Miss Zio to save up her money. After an unknown period of time, the sound of the doorbell rang, breaking the afternoon silence. The visitor was a man in a dark green postman uniform. He smiled at Klein in a fawning manner. "Are you Mr. Sherlock Moriarty?" he asked. "Yes." Klein could vaguely guess the purpose of the other person's visit. The visitor raised his right hand and handed over a palm-sized item that was wrapped in layers of black gauze. "Please sign and accept your package." Klein deliberately revealed his doubts. "Shouldn't you give me a slip and let me go to the corresponding post office for collection?" The Lowen Kingdom's postal system was a perfect replica of the Intis system, and even the flaws were copied quite significantly. Anything that couldn't be stuffed directly into the mailbox, no matter what it was, would only be given a collection slip by the postman, making the recipient go through the hassle of collecting it himself. "Haha, because it's rather precious, so I have to personally deliver it to you," the postman said after a momentary shock. "It seems you're not professional enough to be a real postman." Without further questions, Klein accepted the package, pen, and slip before signing them. He closed the door and returned to the living room. He didn't rush to open the package, but he took out a gold coin and threw it into the air. "Paw!" Klein caught the gold coin and looked down to see if it was heads or tails. A number faced up, indicating a negative response. "There's no latent danger." Klein nodded slightly and put away the gold coin. He touched the paper figurine in his pocket and carefully opened the package. After one layer after another of black gauze was removed, the objects inside clearly presented themselves to him. They were a pale gold-colored, elegantly patterned pocket watch, a handkerchief stained with dark red blood, 7 or 8 brown short curly hair tied together, and a stack of notes. Talam's belongings, his hair, his blood, and his daily records, are all present. Prince Adesic sure is a very efficient man. It's not even nighttime. Klein looked at the items on the coffee table and suddenly felt that there were many people staring at him at that very moment. An ancient angel family with a heritage of more than 2,000 years would definitely have an unimaginable background. Being involved with the royal family's internal strife makes it possible for me to be pulverized at any moment and anywhere. Maybe I'm already being monitored now. I have to appear mediocre and useless enough to ensure my safety. Klein had already decided what to do, so he took his time checking the pocket watch, handkerchief, and hair. During this process, his spiritual intuition didn't give him any warnings, nor did it prevent him from attempting divination. After having a better grasp on the situation, Klein took out the letter, picked up a pen, and wrote his divination sentence, the true cause of Talam Dumont's death. He acted big-hearted and poised, as though he didn't feel that he was being monitored at that very moment. Picking up the curly hair and handkerchief, Klein chanted the divination sentence while leaning back against the back of the sofa. His eyes turned deep as he entered cogitation. After repeating it 7 times, he came to the dream world and saw the familiar lobby of the Quelaag Club. And then he saw Talam Duman clutch at his heart, his face contorted once again. This revelation shows that Talam did die of a sudden heart disease. Klein opened his eyes and muttered softly to himself. He frowned, wearing a puzzled, confused, and thoughtful expression. He tried several different divination statements and received the same result. He got up and paced back and forth several times. He punched himself in the head, as though he was angry that he wasn't good enough to help his friend or find out who the culprit was. In the end, he dejectedly sat down and didn't move for a long time. In the dark room, he was like the silhouette of a stone statue. That should be enough. I can't go overboard. If there's no one monitoring me, then I would have been fighting with the air just now. Klein shook his head in a self-deprecating manner, got up, and walked to the kitchen. After dinner, he seemed to perk up again before he read the stack of notes carefully, including what Talam had done and who he had met on the day and the days prior to his death. Home, Red Rose Manor, Quelaag Club, Viscount Conrad's mansion. There's nothing out of the ordinary about it. Klein picked up a sharpened pencil and drew circles, marking out the places he would visit and the targets he would ask about in the next few days. After doing all of this, he let out a long sigh. Without confidence, he packed up his things, washed up, and went to bed. In the middle of the night, when the red moon was hidden by layers of clouds, Klein suddenly opened his eyes and woke up. He got out of bed, opened the door slowly, and went into the bathroom next door, hiding himself with a paper figurine substitute in the process. Walking 4 steps counterclockwise, he arrived above the grey fog and sat down at the seat which belonged to the fool. His eyes had become clear, no longer dispirited, dejected, and pessimistic. Soon after, Klein took the blood-stained handkerchief from a hidden pocket in his pajamas made out of old clothes. When he was packing his things, he had used his Beyonder powers as a magician to hide the handkerchief on his body. After taking a deep breath, Klein conjured a pen and paper, and he wrote down the divination sentence that was no different from the beginning: the true cause of Talon Dumont's death. After he repeated it 7 times with his body and mind in peace and quiet, he leaned back in his chair with the paper and handkerchief in his hand and fell asleep in the silent and empty old palace. In a gray, separated, and illusory world, Klein saw a completely different scene from before. Presented before his eyes was a palm-sized wooden puppet, carved with eyes, a nose, and a mouth. There were a few drops of dark red blood on the puppet's body, giving it a demonic appearance. A palm stretched out. The skin was white and exquisite, smooth, and beautiful, with 5 slender and delicate fingers that accentuated the hand's flesh and bones. The most eye-catching thing was a unique ring with an inlaid sapphire on the hand's pinky finger. Paw! The hand's index finger was wreathed in black flames as it pointed at the heart of the wooden puppet. Without a sound, the scene shattered and Klein woke up from his dream. His initial judgment wasn't wrong. Talon had died under a curse. But there was a problem. He had already seen the scene of the curse happening, so why wasn't the scene displayed in its entirety? The mysterious space above the gray fog is able to get rid of all interference. Klein was puzzled for a moment. Normally speaking, receiving a revelation that too abstract and easy to misread was a problem with his limited divination abilities. It meant that the difficulty of the matter he was divining was too high and that it had nothing to do with the gray fog. It was an understandable outcome, but he had clearly seen the scene of the murderous curse, but he was limited to a small scope of the situation. It didn't provide a relatively effective revelation and was rather baffling. Have I encountered such a similar situation in the past? Klein dug through his past experiences. Suddenly, he sat up straight, remembering a similar experience. In Tingen, when he was divining the real reason behind the countless coincidences, something similar had happened. He could clearly see the house with the red chimney, but he couldn't reach Ince Zangwil and sealed artifact 008. This is the power of someone or something that's at the level of a grade 0 sealed artifact that's resisting the power of the gray fog? Klein's eyes abruptly narrowed. No, not necessarily. There are still quite a few possibilities. I have to confirm it again. He put in a lot of effort in order to calm down. As for the method used for confirming, it wasn't daunting for the experienced him. The method was simple, redoing the same divination again. If the revelation doesn't change, it means that things aren't so terrible, and if divination is no longer successful, then something around the target or the target is resisting the gray fog to some extent, like 008. Taking a deep breath, Klein calmly repeated the previous divination. The true cause of Talon Dumont's death. Ellipsis. He leaned back in his chair and chanted in a low voice, his eyes growing darker. In the dream, all he could see was a hazy, shattered gray fog. There were no more wooden puppets or fingers. Whoosh! Klein straightened his back, his expression abnormally grave. What did Talon get himself involved in? He frowned as he muttered to himself. There's no question as to what I should do next. It's to be passive and perfunctory. I'll first lie to Prince Adesic before telling him that I'm incapable of figuring out the truth. Phew, this world is really scary. Just the slightest bit of carelessness would cause me to come into contact with something extremely terrifying. Klein sighed. Without daring to stay any longer, he quickly returned to the bathroom in the real world. Tuesday, 9 a.m. at the Crown Cemetery. Klein stood at the edge of the crowd, wearing a black shirt, black vest, and a black tweed coat whilst he was carrying some fresh flowers he bought for 12 soli. He looked gravely at Talon Dumont's coffin being carried over, had his soul put to rest, and was buried bit by bit into the earth. During this process, Talon's mother's eyes were red and swollen. She wanted to speak a few times, but she couldn't find her voice. His father's hair was gray, and his expression was haggard. He just stood there, trembling slightly. When the scene reflected in his eyes, Klein tilted his head back and closed his eyes. He waited until the mourners had left before he walked over, bent over, and placed the white flowers on top of the others. I'm sorry, he silently said inwardly. Standing up, he stepped aside and was about to leave when Klein noticed reporter Mike and Surgeon Aaron closing in. What a pity. I never thought that Talon would actually. Sigh. Mike's expression was pained as he couldn't finish his sentence. Aaron, who was always cold, took off his glasses and wiped the corners of his eyes. He sighed and said, he's a warm-hearted guy. He shouldn't have ended up like this. Yes, he could have gotten rid of his grandfather's bad reputation, Klein echoed. Just then, he saw a female figure in a thick black dress with a veil covering her face walk up to Talam's grave. She, too, was also carrying a bouquet of white flowers. Klein looked away, not paying much attention, just keeping watch through the corner of his eye. The woman bent down to release the flower, revealing her left palm, which was covered by a black gauze glove. A blue gem faintly appeared on the pinky of her left palm. Klein's scalp tingled instantly. His entire body felt numb. A similar feeling that wasn't unfamiliar. The experienced Klein immediately used his clown powers to control his facial expression and the slight trembling of his body. Without rushing, he gently retracted his gaze, making the casual glance from before appear normal. Sigh, Talam was so young. He wasn't even married and has no children. Klein sighed as he went with the flow. He had said this because it gave him a plausible explanation for his subtle reaction towards the woman who had offered the flowers. He had turned sad having seen a woman who had some connection with Talam, associated her to marriage and family, and then finally how his friend had passed away at an early age. Yeah, actually, at his age, he should have been married 4 or 5 years ago. Unfortunately, the matter with his grandfather left him with an extremely strong psychological trauma. He had always rejected marriage, and only recently did he improve. Reporter Mike sighed. At this moment, the seemingly normal Klein seemed to have a cluster of thorns stabbing at his back, slowly piercing into his skin and flesh, causing him to feel extremely tense. The girl in the black dress with the sapphire ring on her left-hand pinky had straightened her body and calmly surveyed her surroundings. Afterward, she quietly left Talam's grave with 2 maids accompanying her. She silently walked further and further away from Talam's grave. Phew, Klein secretly heaved a sigh of relief. The feeling of his back being stabbed quickly turned into a cold sweat. Just who was she, and why did she come to the grave to offer flowers? Talam's lover? However, how could Talam, who had no wealth or status, have a relationship with a terrifying person who is involved with a Grade 0 sealed artifact or that of a demigod? This isn't a novel. Furthermore, she should be the one that used a curse to kill Talam. This matter runs deep. Klein listened quietly as Mike and Aaron recounted Talam's past. His thoughts quickly dispersed, feeling that the most puzzling thing about this matter was that Talam's death, an ordinary person who had no money, power, status, or strength, was actually involved with a Grade 0 sealed artifact or a powerhouse of the same level. This was simply inconceivable. But this isn't an isolated case. There's another similar case that has happened around me. Klein suddenly thought of something and looked at the surgeon, Aaron. This ordinary person's home might very well be hiding a Sequence 1 snake of Mercury. Following this train of thought, Klein recalled the nearly 5 months that he had spent here since he transmigrated. He was stunned to discover that he had unconsciously become involved with many demigods and terrifying sealed artifacts. The woman who had killed Talam, the Snake of Mercury, Will Osepton, the blasphemer Aemon, the mysterious woman at the Royal Museum, a high-sequence Beyander of the Rose School of Thought, 008, 1-42, Ince Zangwil, the mutated Sun Sacred Emblem, the Antigonus family's notebook, Mr. Azek Eggers, who suspected to be a descendant of death, Mr. Dor, the Twilight Hermit Order. Each name flashed through Klein's mind, and every single one of them made him feel like drawing in a cold breath. He calmed his heart and carefully thought, these don't include the true Creator and the eternal blazing sun, who are ranked high above these. Strictly speaking, I can be considered to be among their ranks. After all, I came from a dark divination, and I'm a strange alternate world soul who controls the strange grey fog. Could this be another crest of the times after Roussel? So all the demigods and terrifying sealed artifacts are making an appearance in real life. As these thoughts flashed through Klein's mind, the grief-stricken reporter Mike and surgeon Aaron excused themselves. He then left the cemetery at a leisurely pace. Just as he was looking around for a rental carriage, a familiar carriage drove out of a secluded spot and stopped in front of him. Although the coat of arms on the black carriage was skillfully concealed, Klein was still able to recognize it as Prince Adesak's carriage. Without a sound, the door of the carriage opened, and the old butler with his meticulously combed hair alighted. He politely made a gesture of invitation. His Highness is waiting for you. All right. Klein didn't feel guilty at all as he entered the spacious and warm carriage. Prince Adesak was dressed in a dark blue coat with a large collar and a golden ribbon across his chest, which made him look very abnormally noble. He rubbed the diamond brooch, and his long and narrow eyes showed hints of a sigh. I'm restricted even when participating in the funeral of a friend. I couldn't appear in person and could only watch from afar, sending someone to offer flowers for me. This is the royal family's lack of freedom. If Talem's grandfather hadn't lost his aristocratic title, then you wouldn't have to avoid anything. Klein abided by Prince Adesak's gesture and sat across from him. Adesak picked up a cup of blood-red wine and said, "Sigh, I had originally planned to find an opportunity to help Talem's father recover his aristocratic title, but unfortunately." Instead of going deep into the subject, he asked, "Sherlock, did you receive the package?" "Yes," Klein answered any questions he was asked, never giving any additional descriptions. Adesak nodded slightly. "Any progress?" "I made several divinations using Talem's hair, blood, and belongings, but all of them led to the conclusion that he had died of a sudden heart disease." Klein used his emotionless, smooth narration to imply that my sequence isn't high enough. My standards are limited. Although I'm good at divination, the other party is stronger, and I'm sure that I can't figure out the truth. Adesak looked disappointed and sighed. "How do you plan on continuing the investigation?" "Starting with the people Talem came in contact with a few days before his death and the places he went," Klein replied according to the plan. Adesak looked at the old butler. "There will definitely be no lack of threatening interrogations or bribery." Pay Sherlock £100 for his investigation fees." "Yes, Your Highness." The old butler took out a stack of bills that he had prepared earlier. £100 straight out? Once again, Klein felt Prince Adesak's generosity. "I'll do my best." He took the £100 in cash and pocketed it without counting it in detail. "I hope that we can put Talem to rest." Prince Adesak clenched his right fist and tapped the left side of his chest. He turned his head to look out the window at Crown Cemetery, which wasn't too far away. His friendship for Talem still remained strong. Klein sighed before he was led out to a carriage by the old butler. In Empress Borough, the opulent villa of Earl Hall. Audrey looked at her psychology teacher, whose long hair reached her waist, and she pretended to carefully look from side to side. She immediately lowered her voice and said, "Miss Escalante, I recently joined a new Beander gathering. There were high offers for a human skin shadow characteristic in the wind-blessed potion formula." Different people. These are likely mid-sequence items, right? It sounds quite interesting. Right. Will the psychology alchemists be interested? Escalante was startled. She pondered for a few seconds and said, "I'll ask when I return." "All right," Audrey responded briskly, as though she were simply intrigued by such mid-sequence transactions. Escalante retracted her attention and said in a serious tone, "Miss Audrey, although you are already a Sequence 8 Beander, you have yet to receive formal education in mysticism. You still don't understand enough about the techniques and applications of a spectator and telepathist, as well as the foundation theories. Starting today, I'll guide you to become a true Beander." "That's what I wish," Audrey said sincerely. The huge golden retriever, Susie, who was sitting by her feet, wagged its tail happily, as if happy for her mistress. Having made up his mind not to work, Klein took the carriage back to 15 Minsk Street. He opened the door and was just about to take off his hat when he froze. His spiritual intuition told him that a stranger had entered the living room. Someone had entered his room. He barely hid his tracks. Is it considered a warning? Having a warning is better than not having one. Klein stood in the hall for a long time in silence. Immediately, he turned around and went to the steam cathedral in a rental carriage. The cathedral towered over the chimneys and clock tower, the former representing the power of steam, while the latter represented the beauty of machinery through the hanging of its intricate clocks. It was neither the weekend nor noon or the evening, so there were only a few devotees in the hall quietly praying. Klein sat down in the aisle, leaned his cane, took off his hat, and pretended to pray for 10 minutes in front of the sacred emblem. Then, he picked up his things and walked along the aisle to the altar. He said to the bishop standing to the side, "I wish to make a confession." "Good, God is watching you." The bishop, who had a kind face and hoary hair at his temples, walked to the confessional by his side. Klein followed closely behind and closed the door. He sat down on a chair and said to the bishop through the wooden board, "I confess that I didn't adhere to my principles when facing danger, and I chose to retreat." "What were you thinking at the time?" the bishop gently asked. Klein immediately described in detail about Talem's death, his suspicions, the reminder from the machinery hivemind, Prince Adesak's entrustment, and, after how he failed to obtain any answers from his divination, he expressed his heartfelt cowardice in the face of the royal family's strife. The reason he didn't go straight to Carlson was that he was afraid that not only was he being watched, but Prince Adesak's men were also watching him from the shadows. Once he made his intentions clear, he couldn't be sure if he would encounter another calamity. The Steam Cathedral was the headquarters of the Church of the God of Steam and Machinery, and it was one of the 3 great holy temples. No one could spy on whatever happened inside. What Klein intended to do was to use the Church of the God of Steam to convey his true thoughts and avoid getting caught up in a deeper conflict. Simply put, it was to comply with what his heart wanted. The bishop listened quietly and answered without changing his tone, "Your choice derives from human instinct. God will not blame you. Go back, God will protect you." "That's good." Klein understood the hint and quietly left the Steam Cathedral. Standing on the street outside, looking at the misty sky, he sighed silently. "I need to advance as soon as possible." Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the pitch-black city walls. Carrying a leather bag on his back and the axe of Hurricane in hand, Derek Berg stood outside the doorway to a cave with nearly 10 of his teammates. Lifting his eyes up, he saw that, between the stone cracks of the city wall, the dry and hardened black soil was crusting, but a bunch of tenacious weeds had grown out. They were densely packed and resembled human hair. At that moment, he hurriedly withdrew his gaze and looked towards the city gate when he heard light footsteps. As the lightning and darkness alternated, a tall figure slowly walked over, carrying 2 straight swords which were crossed on his back. Then, his pale, disheveled hair, his ancient eyes, his twisted, deep, old scars, and his perennially unchanged brown coat and flaxen-colored shirt entered Derek and the other's sight. The approaching person was the chief of the 6-member council of the City of Silver, Colin Iliad, a powerful demon hunter. After greeting him, Derek subconsciously looked at the chief's waist. There was a leather belt divided into many compartments, each with a different metal bottle inside. This was a symbol of an experienced and powerful demon hunter. Derek had previously heard his parents mention that demon hunters were good at discovering the weaknesses for different monsters, identifying the uses of various materials, and were able to use their special cogitation state against the former. With the latter, they could concoct corresponding magical medicine, holy ointments, essential oils, and special imprints. Then, through consumption, smearing, and using these items, they could achieve the effect of restraining the target. In a sense, experienced, knowledgeable, well-prepared, and sharp demon hunters were the nemesis of the vast majority of monsters. The amount and variety of small metal bottles at their waist represented their experience. Of course, this was only a portion of the demon hunters' Beyonder powers. Just by relying on these, they couldn't be called demigods or saints. Colin looked around and confirmed that all the team members were present. He then said in a low voice, "Light up. Let's go." 2 team members immediately lit the candles in their lanterns, letting the faint yellow light shine through the extremely thin leather. During daytime, when the frequency of lightning was relatively high, there was no need to use candles in the City of Silver as there was illumination every 2 to 3 seconds. Furthermore, the monsters in the nearby area had been cleaned out again and again. However, once they left the City of Silver and entered the darkness, they had to maintain sufficient candlelight. Otherwise, once the lightning failed to illuminate the skies, causing a dark environment that exceeded 5 seconds, there was a high chance for the team to suffer from an assault by certain monsters. Intense fighting wasn't the most frightening development. What Derek remembered so vividly was a story his parents had told him. Once, while they were exploring the depths of the darkness, because of a previous battle with a horde of rotting corpses, the candles couldn't be replaced in time. This led them to endure being engulfed in darkness for as long as 8 seconds. When the lightning flashed again and the candlelight appeared, they were stunned to see that only 5 of their original 8 teammates remained. The other 3 had vanished in silence, never to be seen again. Taking a deep breath, Derek gripped the axe of Hurricane tightly and walked in the middle of the team, following the chief in a predetermined direction. A bolt of lightning flashed, causing the plains covered in tall black grass to appear like an eerie oil painting. The exploratory team of 10 Beyonders walked along the path filled with craggy gravel, venturing deep into the black grass. The lightning subsided, and the dense darkness instantly swept over them, almost completely engulfing them. The yellow candlelight pierced through the leather and, weakly, swayed to and fro, guarding the surrounding area. East Borough, in a greasy and cheap coffee shop. In accordance with the previously agreed upon appointment, Klein found Old Kohler, who was applying butter to his toast. He glanced at the crumpled cigarette on the table and smiled. "Newly bought? No, it's from the past. I haven't smoked since, but I would always carry it with me, occasionally taking it out to sniff at it. Heh, this will remind me of that vagrant life of mine. Back then, I really felt like I could die at any moment." Old Kohler's tone carried a hint of fear. Klein took 20 soldi in change, which he had changed earlier, and pushed it across the table while sitting down. I was very satisfied with the information from the last time. Without waiting for old Kohler to give a modest reply, he turned his head and looked towards the counter. A loaf of oatmeal bread, 2 slices of toast, a block of butter, a serving of beef stew with potatoes, and a 1-pence cup of tea. Mr. Moriarty, didn't you have dinner yesterday? Old Kohler was stunned for a moment as he held the cash. Klein shook his head and smiled. I'll be very busy later and might not have time for lunch. He needed to pretend that he was active and serious. After all, he had received £100 from Prince Adesic. Old Kohler didn't ask any more questions. He looked around cautiously while stuffing the notes into his pocket. There are some results from the matter you previously asked me to find out more about. Isaac Eggers's bounty comes from a few gang leaders and some intelligence dealers. Well, I don't know who entrusted the task to them since it's difficult to make contact with them. MI9. Klein nodded. That's enough. There's no need to delve deeper. It's too dangerous. Old Kohler heaved a sigh of relief and said, 2 days ago, someone at a budget hotel on Golden Cloak Street saw someone who appeared to be Isaac Eggers. It said that the person was basically a carbon copy of the picture on the bounty notice. Quote. Klein's heart palpitated as he smiled instead of showing surprise. And then? Could it be that the moment I prepared to try for this bounty, the matter is over? And then? With that clue, quite a number of bounty hunters rushed over, but they didn't find anything. Well, they said that there were traces of a fight in the room. Old Kohler tried his best to recall the information he had gathered. The intelligence would definitely be sent to MI9 first. Did Mr. Isaac have a secret standoff with them? I wonder what the outcome was. Klein took a glance at the boss who was coming over with a plate. He pretended to mutter to himself and said to old Kohler, take me to Golden Cloak Street later. Maybe I can find some clues. It was past breakfast time in East Borough, and there were very few customers in the cheap coffee shop. All right, old Kohler agreed without hesitation. A total of 16.5 pence. The boss placed Klein's breakfast on the table. There wasn't much beef with the potatoes, but the stew was very overcooked. It was obvious that it had been prepared beforehand. The thick aroma tantalized old Kohler's taste buds to the point that he involuntarily gulped a mouthful of saliva. After paying the bill, Klein picked up a fork and spoon and said to old Kohler, continue. There aren't many people looking for the believers of the fool anymore, except for a few stubborn bounty hunters. Many unemployed textile women, including some male workers, left East Borough. Old Kohler went down a list of matters. What? Klein swallowed the beef and looked up. Left East Borough? They must have found some other job. As for where they went, I couldn't find out, old Kohler answered truthfully. Their families aren't aware? Klein pressed. Some left with their unemployed family members, while others had come alone from outside the city to search for work. Old Kohler had already done some investigations. Judging from the target's choice, there's something wrong. Klein made a mental note of it and continued to eat while he listened to old Kohler talk about matters that had happened in East Borough recently. After making an appointment for the next meeting, he put down the cutlery, wiped his mouth, picked up his hat, and said, let's head for Golden Cloak Street. Ellipsis. In the only budget hotel on Golden Cloak Street. After the boss accepted a 2-pence tip, he led Klein and old Kohler to the room which was suspected to be where Isaac Eggers used to live. There have been many bounty hunters visiting over this period of time. It made me earn quite a bit, so I have maintained its original state. The hotel owner opened the door with his key and pointed inside. At first glance, Klein saw overturned chairs and rags scattered everywhere. There were no other signs of a fight. With his considerable spiritual perception, Klein cast his gaze under the bed. After staring for 2 seconds, he walked over and bent down to pat the bed. Dust flew into the air with a poof as a gray rat jumped out from under the bed. It looked normal, without any problems, but in Klein's spirit vision, its aura only had the colors, black and green. The rat turned a corner and climbed up a wall, exposing its belly to Klein's eyes. In that soft spot, its flesh was green with flowing pus. One could see that his internal organs had similarly rotted away. Klein thoughtfully looked back at old Kohler, who wasn't paying attention to the rat. Has the bounty for Isaac Eggers been withdrawn? No. Old Kohler shook his head in confirmation. Klein examined it again, he then stepped out and said, let's go, there's no valuable clues. 15 Minsk Street. Klein, who had been busy all day, lay down on his bed and entered the dream world. Scenes that were continuous at times, and at other times fragmented, swept past, and all of a sudden, Klein woke up. He knew that he was dreaming. A power has invaded my dreams. Klein maintained his previous day's state, casually sizing up his surroundings. He found himself in a suburb of fertile fields. A river flowed over from the distance and made a turn around the cliff in front of him. One side of the cliff was bare, revealing a pure white rock. Looking from afar, it seemed to have a kind of holy beauty. Nearly 10 men and women wearing black coats or dark jackets surrounded a hidden underground entrance to the bay. Among them was Klein's acquaintance, Ikanzer Bernard. White Cliff Town, Stratford River Creek, Machinery Hive Mind. Are they exploring the Amen family tomb? But why would there be scenes of it in my dreams? Klein was puzzled. At that moment, he saw the water on the surface of the river undulate, rapidly forming a line of white words. Your loyal and humble servant, Rhodes, is here to report to you on the exploration situation. Quote. Klein's mouth turned agape, momentarily losing the ability to speak. Then, a voice echoed in his head. Tell me, why would a perfectly good mirror be a snitch? In an instant, Klein switched to his unfathomable state as the fool who overlooked everything. He nodded and said, not bad. Ahead of him, the river surged, and the white words squirmed and changed before taking shape again. What follows is the exploration process your loyal servant, Rhodes, has recorded. You can choose to speed up or skip certain scenes at any time. This sentence froze for 2 seconds, and then the scene abruptly zoomed in. Klein instantly appeared beside Ikanzer Bernard, but no one noticed him. He looked around and felt that he was surrounded by living people with lifelike scenes. Nothing about his surroundings looked unreal, making him feel as if though he was there in person. I can even speed up or skip certain scenes. The original form of this mirror, Rhodes, is a virtual reality family cinema. Klein couldn't help but lampoon. He took another look at the Machinery Hivemind members and saw that it was led by an old man in white priest robes and a cleric cap. His face was unusually kind, and his expression was calm and gentle. Your Grace, everyone is ready. Ikanzer approached the elder and said with a bow. Archbishop, this is the Archbishop of the Church of Steam and Machinery's Backland Diocese, the demigod, Horamak Haydn? The Machinery Hivemind really is cautious, and not careless. Who knows, they might have even brought along a Grade 1 sealed artifact and performed a divination in advance. After all, they're in control of the mystery prior pathway. Luckily, I can basically confirm that the Fog's anti-divination or divination interference abilities are similar to the Cards of Blasphemy, allowing the result to be as ordinary as possible and the least bit suspicious. Otherwise, certain matters might be exposed. However, there's a certain probability that the meeting between Miss Sharon and I will appear, because, to me, that isn't something harmful. It depends on whether a wraith's instinct to interfere with divination will affect the Machinery Hivemind's attempt. Wait, the Machinery Hivemind is highly likely to have relied on Rhodes, and based on its performance from just now and previously, it isn't impossible for him to curry favor with me by adding some mosaics. Klein thought in enlightenment. At this point, Horamak Haydn drew a triangular sacred emblem on his chest. Begin the operation. God will protect us. Nearly 10 Beyonders headed down as Klein followed closely behind. He didn't fast forward at all. He had always been curious about the combat styles of low and mid-sequence Beyonders of the Machinery Hivemind, and he wanted to take this opportunity to experience it. In addition, he was also greatly concerned about how a demigod really did in combat, as well as the secrets hidden in the Amen family tomb. After being ransacked by time, in a period spanning 1 or 2,000 years, the black marble staircase still retained its hardness without any signs of corrosion. The Machinery Hivemind members followed it all the way underground, where they saw the unique asymmetrical stone pillars and axe and blade scuffing from the period of the Fourth Epoch. The pillars stood on either side of the wide road, and in front of them was a large, heavy, dark grey stone bifold door. The stone door had already cracked open, wide enough for 2 people to walk alongside each other. It was completely dark inside. The Machinery Hivemind members were in no hurry to enter. They carefully searched the surrounding area with lanterns, but they found nothing of value. According to the plan, the first group will begin with a preliminary cleanup. With the Archbishop's approval, Ikanzer pushed down his hat, compressing his fluffy hair. Cleanup? By the side, Klein ruminated over the word. Amidst his puzzlement, the 2 strongest and burliest male Machinery Hivemind team members each laid down a long black box on their backs and opened them up. Inside one long box was a sturdy, heavy, iron-black cannon-shaped object. Its surface was engraved with dense and arcane patterns. In the other box was a complex and exquisite firearm with a chain of pale golden bullets inserted into it. One of the two team members carried the cannon-shaped object and trudged to the open stone door. Another Machinery Hivemind member picked up the peculiar gun, adjusted the bullet chain, and followed slightly behind. After the two of them glanced at each other, the cannon-shaped object on the former's shoulder rapidly lit up, outlining burning patterns and imprints before a loud salvo. Boom! A golden fireball, akin to a miniature sun, flew out from the cannon barrel, and into the darkness. Boom! The ground trembled slightly, and intense light was emitted from the crack. The body of the Machinery Hivemind member, who was holding onto the cannon barrel, clearly sank a little as his feet trembled. Boom! 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 He repeatedly used the Byander weapon to launch one golden cannonball, after another at different spots, causing the tomb to sway without a speck of dust falling. After he came to a stop, the team member with the peculiar gun stepped forward and pulled the trigger. Daw! 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 The sound of machine gun fire echoed as one pale golden bullet after another flew out, purifying the danger in the depths of the darkness. Isn't this the bombardment effect I've always wanted? Furthermore, they're using Byander expendables like purifying bullets and exorcism cannonballs. How extravagant! Is this the combat style of the Machinery Hivemind? Klein stared with his eyes wide open and his mouth slightly agape. After the series of savage bombardments, Ikanzer raised his voice above the rumbling echoes and said, "Group 2, do the follow-up cleanup." There's more. Klein felt a little numb from what was happening. The second group was also made up of two team members who used scrolls made of different kinds of leather. They chanted simplified incantations, activated the scrolls, and tossed them inside. The construct behind the stone door was suddenly shrouded by gentle and pure light. Droplets of golden holy rain pattered down, cleansing everything in the area. Klein looked at this scene and suddenly found it somewhat ridiculous. Wait, aren't you guys here to engage in archaeological studies? Aren't you professional archaeologists? Aren't you afraid that the tomb would collapse from using such cleanup methods? While these thoughts flashed through his mind, the second team was done, and they shouted at Ikanzer, "Deacon, as expected, the construct's structural integrity hasn't been destroyed." They were clearly prepared. All right, continue forward. Ikanzer gave the order. Klein walked in the middle, through the stone door, and saw piles of dirt and debris on the ground. It was impossible to tell what kind of monsters had once been active here, and no one could guess the functions of the mechanisms that had been set up here. After these cleaning up procedures, as long as one didn't dodge in advance, no Byander below that of high-sequence Byanders would be able to withstand it. Klein once again gained a deeper understanding of what the aesthetic of violence was like and what it meant to be simple, direct, and unreasonable. In what followed, the previous scenes were repeated over and over again. The Machinery Hivemind team members smoothly approached, exploring one area after another, occasionally harvesting some Byander characteristics that were beginning to gather. There are no murals. Seeing the main tomb chamber in sight, the Archbishop of the Church of the God of Steam, Horamak Haydn, stopped and muttered to himself in puzzlement. Klein, who was considered half a historian, was equally puzzled. Generally speaking, a noble family member's grave would more or less express their position and honor when they were alive. And when a grave became a tomb or even a mausoleum, it was very common for a mural to be used to describe its master's life when it possessed enough space. In even older and more obscure eras, this wasn't rare, and it was even the most common method. The first thing humans learned was drawings, not writing. Thus, it really was a little strange that there were no similar murals in the tomb of a fourth epoch noble family. Upon hearing the Archbishop's question, Ikanzer immediately ordered the men to spread out in groups of 2 to search the vicinity for relevant traces of murals. Watching from the sidelines, Klein couldn't help but want to fast forward a little to immediately see the outcome. At that moment, he noticed that the 2 Machinery Hivemind members in the left corner had suddenly turned into 3. One of them looked identical to Ikanzer Bernard, his fluffy hair propping his hat high. This, Klein was first stunned before he made a guess. The moment he had the thought, Ikanzer walked over to the team member closest to him. Any discoveries? He cleared his throat and lowered his voice. The team member turned around warily, but immediately relaxed when he saw that it was Deacon Ikanzer. No, before he could finish his sentence, the Ikanzer in front of him suddenly turned into a piece of human skin and enveloped his body. The pale human skin tightly wrapped around him, and his face began to form the outline of his facial features. During this process, there were no additional sounds, nor were there any abnormal movements that were triggered. All of a sudden, the human skin began to emit rays of light, just like the rising of the sun. The human skin immediately turned translucent and quickly soared into the air as if it was being burned. A black whip immediately lashed out, striking its body, causing its movements to clearly slow down. In such a battle, slowness was an original sin. One Byander weapon after another, burning scrolls, and pale golden bullets were released towards the human skin. After a brilliant burst of light, countless ashes fell from the sky. All of them coruscated faint light and slowly struggled to gather together. It really is a human skin shadow. Klein turned his attention to the machinery hivemind members who had just been attacked. The man pulled at his collar and pulled out a protective charm. There were many symbols and magic labels related to the sun on it. Thankfully, the Archbishop got us to wear these things. He held the lantern and sincerely praised. It was only then that Klein realized that his brooch had the quality of the night, his ring had the intensity of the storm, and his belt exuded the sense of physical strength. Although they aren't all mystical items, most of them are in the category of charms and Byander weapons. Even if their effects will quickly decline, they're still worth a lot. If you weren't an artisan or a rich Byander, there's no way to gather that much. Is this the combat style of the machinery hivemind? Burning money. Klein felt a sudden setback, and it took him a long time to recover. At that moment, the human skin shadow characteristic gathered and took form. It was like a huge diamond with countless sides reflecting light, and each side reflected a different face. The faces were densely packed, layered, and left one dizzy. I'm just short of it. Klein was overjoyed. After the machinery hivemind handled the spoils, they continued to search for the murals, but they didn't find any traces of them. They had no choice but to gather again and head for the passageway that led to the main tomb. After another series of bombardments, the passage into the main tomb was revealed to the members of the machinery hivemind. The ground was littered with debris. The diamond-shaped Byander characteristic that reflected a human face lay silently at the bottom of the right wall, glowing with the light of two other objects. The entire tunnel, including the two walls that line the sides and the stone ceiling, was filled with potholes. However, one thing remained undamaged. It was a frame that was hung up ahead about 7 meters away. It was brown in color, and the wood grain was obvious, but only the side of the frame was revealed. Without anyone mentioning anything, all the Byanders present could tell that it was strange. At this moment, the Archbishop of the Church of Steam and Machinery, Horamek Haydn, stepped forward and said in a gentle voice, "This is likely to be the spectre portrait frame that belongs to the Amen family according to the records. As long as one walks into its range and is illuminated by it, their spirit body will instantly be separated from their flesh and blood, turning into a portrait and be forever sealed inside. In this state, even if the portrait is replaced, there is no way of rescuing the person without the corresponding methods. If the duration of being sealed is too long, the body would already be dead. Then, even if one grasps the correct method to remove the seal, the spirit will quickly dissipate." As he spoke, Horamek moved forward, step by step, closing in on the strange frame. Klein was a bit worried, not daring to watch the demigod fight against the sealed artifact, but he quickly realized that he was just watching a scene provided by the magic mirror, Erodes. What was there to be afraid of? This is very normal, it's just like watching a horror movie or playing a dark game. Klein calmed himself as he quickened his pace and caught up with Horamek Haydn. The demigod archbishop quickly reached the confines of where the mystical item that needed to be sealed was. He wore a white priest robe and a clerical cap, and his figure gradually appeared in the glass on the surface of the picture frame. Glass? Glass in the fourth epoch? Seems to be the case. There has at least been glass in the fifth epoch's history all this time, and there has been no mention of who invented it. Klein waited with great interest for the battle between the demigod and the strange sealed artifact. Horamek's upper body fully appeared within the spectre portrait frame, but his eyes didn't lose their luster. He walked towards the frame, face to face. The silhouette within the painting flickered, as though it was constantly shrinking, yet it was unable to succeed. Horamek stopped, took out a large, almost opaque black cloth he had long prepared, and he covered the spectre portrait frame. The frame trembled a few times, but in the end, it was completely covered by the black cloth and turned silent. Horamek seemed to be unaffected as he effortlessly removed the spectre portrait frame and finished wrapping it with the black cloth before tying a knot on its back. This isn't mystic. Didn't you say that your spirit body would be absorbed into the frame and be turned into a portrait? Why is the archbishop fine? Is this the uniqueness of a demigod, or is it because another reason? Klein sized up Horamik Haydn, but he didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. His eyes are filled with spirit, his expression genial, and he's rich in flesh and blood. It's a pity that I'm not there in person. Otherwise, I could activate my spirit vision and have a look. Klein retracted his gaze and waited for the machinery Hivemind members, such as Ikanzer, to come over. Horamik handed the Spectre portrait frame to a member of the team and walked towards the main tomb at the end of the passage. There was a black stone door filled with scrapes carved by blades and axes. In the middle of the door was a grayish-white disc. The surface of the disc was divided into 12 segments. There was a black needle, just like a clock from the outside world. However, the segments weren't evenly distributed across the disc. They were of varying sizes and extremely incongruous. Furthermore, each grid had half of its surface covered in a shadow. The coat of arms of the Amen family. Archbishop Horamik made a brief introduction. He didn't explain the symbolic meaning of the coat of arms, because presently only Deacon Ikanzer Bernard was qualified to know. Klein, on the other hand, relied on his own knowledge of mysticism to attempt to decipher it. Disc, 12 segments, and a needle. Combined together, they clearly represent time. It matches the worm of time which Amon's avatar left behind after it was wiped out. What should be 12 equal segments on a disc, are unequal in size, and there's a shadow over a portion of it. Does this mean that the Amen family is the dark side of time? Then, where does their title as a blasphemer family show itself? While Klein was thinking, Archbishop Horamik pushed open the stone door without any protection. The heavy stone door opened, revealing an extremely spacious tomb chamber. In the center of the chamber was a dais with a deep black coffin on top of it. The surrounding walls were decorated with iron lampstands, each holding a burning white candle. All the candles didn't flicker. It was so quiet that it seemed like a scene that was fixed in place, completely devoid of any signs of it suffering the effects of time that spanned 1 to 2,000 years. On the straight path from the stone door to the coffin, there were corpses lying on the ground. They were all wearing black tweed coats, half-top hats, or even ordinary worker clothes with a cap on their heads. It was obvious that they had entered in recent years. The Beyonders that previously recruited helpers? How did they get past the area at the front? The human-skinned shadow and the other monsters were clearly still alive. With a mind filled with questions, Klein looked at the corpses. What he saw left him immediately shocked. The corpses all had sparse white hair, dry and wrinkled skin, and obvious markings on their skin. They looked like 80 or 90-year-olds. There were no obvious wounds on their bodies as though they had died of old age. Furthermore, it appeared as though they had died recently and hadn't even rotted yet. It's very obvious that there wouldn't be this many aged Beyonders exploring the tomb. Even if the discoverers of the tomb were old, they would still try their best to choose the young and strong when recruiting helpers. There's something odd about it. Klein frowned and looked around again. He quickly thought of the worm of time left behind by Amon's avatar, and the coat of arms of the Amen family that represented time on the stone door. Making people age rapidly is one of the Amen family's Beyonder powers? The dark side of time. The loophole in time. Could it be that as others rapidly age, the members of the Amen family would regain their youth and extend their lives? Wait a minute, for these Beyonders to easily barge into this place like that, perhaps it was deliberate on the Tomb Master's part. He wanted to rob them of their time in order to maintain his own existence. Klein looked suspiciously at the black coffin on the platform. At this moment, the demigod, Horamik Haydn, raised his left hand and pressed it down. You will stop here. Yes, Your Grace, Ikanzer and company answered without any hesitation. As members of an official organization, they had read up on a large number of past Beyonder events. They knew that under similar circumstances, they had to obey the will of a high-sequence Beyonder and absolutely couldn't act rashly or else they would die without knowing how. Horamik looked ahead, and his eyes fell on a picture frame that hung upside down at the bottom of the dais. His expression didn't change as he continued to walk forward at a leisurely pace. Not making any preparations at all? The hallmark of demigods is to be rash? Klein was stunned. He seemed to be able to imagine Horamik's teeth dropping, his white hair wilting, and his skin shriveling as he rapidly aged. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Horamik, who seemed fine, suddenly trembled, and a sharp and piercing grinding sound could be heard from his body. His pace began to slow down, his movements became stiff, and his skin visibly dried up. There's something wrong with that. That isn't the aging process of a normal human being. What was that grinding sound just now? Klein muttered inwardly. 4 steps, 5 steps, 6 steps. Ripping sounds came from Horamic's body as something fell to the ground. Klein subconsciously looked over and saw a gear. A gear covered in rust. Horamic continued on as items kept dropping from his body from time to time. There were rusty screws, melted wax, yellowed bones, and loose springs. His figure became increasingly thin and unsteady, as if it could collapse at any time. This is just like a robot. Well, in this era's terms, like a living doll. Klein was suddenly enlightened. He remembered that before Old Neil died, he had said that the Church of Earth Mother's sequence 4 was good at alchemical life, and that the Savon pathway's corresponding sequence was barely able to do so too. As for Horamic, he was a high-sequence Beyander of the Savon pathway. The Horamic in front of me isn't the real him, it's just a refined doll. Just now, the reason why the Spectre portrait frame was ineffective was that a doll doesn't have a spirit body. The real Horamic should still be far away, as expected of a demigod. Amidst Klein's enlightenment, the Archbishop walked up to the dais, bent his knees and back, and turned the upside-down frame over. Generally speaking, when exploring a tomb involving Beyander elements, it was necessary to avoid flipping items over, but this time, Horamic had made the opposite choice. Following the flipping of the portrait frame, a wind suddenly blew in the sealed tomb, dispersing the formless imprisonment and silence. The candles on the iron-colored light fixtures rapidly ignited, becoming unusually bright. However, they soon reached the end of their lives and melted away. The old corpses on the ground rapidly rotted and stank. In just a few seconds, the tomb's main chamber had turned dark, leaving only the lanterns that the Machinery Hivemind members were holding onto to barely illuminate the area ahead. Horamic picked up the picture frame from the floor and went up the stairs to the dais. He came to the black coffin, stretched out his right palm, and forcefully pushed. Creak. The heavy coffin lid opened up a crack with a creaking sound, as though it wasn't nailed shut at all. Horamic looked down and said in the same unchanging voice, "There's no corpse." As the scene drew nearer, Klein saw that the coffin's interior was empty except for a pale gold cushion embroidered with a worm with 12 rings. At that moment, Horamic turned around and the picture frame in his hand was reflected in the eyes of Ikanzer and the others. With just a glance, Klein's gaze suddenly froze. It was a portrait of a smiling young man. He had black eyes and black curly black hair. He had a broad forehead and a thin face. A crystal monocle hung over his eye. He wore a black pointed hat. Amen. Amen. Klein said the word in his mind. He had originally thought that the blasphemer who appeared in the forsaken land of the god City of Silver was a descendant of an ancient family like Amen. Through inheriting the legacy of his ancestors, step by step, he stepped into the demigod ranks. To his surprise, it was very possible that that particular person could very well have lived for more than 2,000 years and was a member of the Amen family when it was at the peak of its strength. An old antique. Why would he, for no good reason, build a tomb for himself? Did he fake his death to get out of a situation, or is there another reason, such as leaving traces so as to have time fixed onto his body? He was able to live from the 4th epoch to the 5th epoch, all because he was siphoning the lives of others? I originally guessed that he's a sequence 3 or sequence 2. Based on what I've seen today, it's not impossible for him to be a sequence 1. After all, long periods of time would eventually bring about an intrinsic improvement. Klein switched back and forth between puzzlement and speculation. His thoughts were like boiling water, gurgling non-stop. The Horamic doll tugged at his throat and accidentally pulled off a piece of skin, revealing the complicated mechanical structure within. His voice came out from that spot and brought with it the impression of leaking air. Search the corpses on the ground. Don't come any closer. Yes, Your Grace. Ikanzer and company heaved a clear sigh of relief. The corpses on the ground had long since produced their Beyander characteristics. Some of them had even combined with certain parts of the body to form a terrifying mystical item. In addition, the dead carried all sorts of items on them. The Machinery Hivemind sure has reaped quite a harvest this time. Together with the Spectre portrait frame and the human skin shadow characteristic, this completely makes up for the crazy expenses of the cleanup. A huge investment for a high return. Klein's eyes lingered on the ground for quite a while. He inhaled, tore his gaze away, and followed Horamic, who didn't carry a lantern, to the wall on the other side of the coffin. At this moment, the magic mirror, Rhodes, brightened up the scene, allowing the things in front of him to be seen clearly. Klein saw that the wall across him had become mottled due to the rapid weathering just now. Many of the murals had been destroyed and could no longer be restored to their original states. The only one that was more complete and could barely be seen clearly was a colorful mural at the top of the wall, which took up a small half of the dome. It described a towering mountain range, and on the highest mountain peak, there was a huge cross that was taller than the mountain. The cross was covered in layers of radiance, making it seem unusually holy. In front of it, a tall and domineering figure could be seen vaguely. The mountain range was like a pet that lay prostrate at its feet. This figure was surrounded by 2-winged, 4-winged, and 6-winged angels. They were holding bugles, playing harps, or playing flutes, looking pious and sprightly. At the foot of the mountain range, 2 12-winged angels were humbly walking towards the mountaintop, each holding a baby in their arms. The baby on the left had curly black hair, and the baby on the right had pale blonde hair. One of their eyes was black, the other golden. Elsewhere in the mountain range, there was a vague depiction of a giant with chains at its legs and a dragon that had its legs bound and never be able to land. Horamek first looked at the baby on the left, and his genial expression became increasingly serious. He said a word in a very low voice, Amen. Then, he turned to look at the baby on the right, and after a few seconds of silence, he said another name, Adam, Amen, Adam. As Klein repeated the names, he felt that the fog that hung over the history of the fourth epoch and the third epoch was growing thicker. He combined all the information he had learned and quickly made a guess. On the mountaintop, the figure in front of the glowing cross is surrounded by angels, with giants and dragons submitting to it. It's definitely a real god that's at sequence 0. Another being who likes to partially use the cross as a symbol is the true creator. It's said that Amen is the descendant of an ancient sun god, but the one at the top of the mountain doesn't seem like a pure sun god. Could it be that he is the Lord that created everything, the omnipotent and omniscient God, that the City of Silver believes in? This is in accordance with the legends of the City of Silver. The awakening of the Creator who stripped the King of Giants and the Dragon of Imagination and other ancient gods of their authorities. The so-called ancient sun god is actually the Lord that created everything as spoken about in the City of Silver? He may be in charge of the domains such as sun and time. In addition, the authorities of the Giant King, Ormir, and the Dragon of Imagination, Ankualt, has likely returned to him. This can no longer be completely contained within sequence 0. So, the original Amen was the descendant of the City of Silver's Lord that created everything, the omnipotent and omniscient God, who inherited the Beyonder characteristics of the time domain. This seems to slightly explain why he remained silent in the City of Silver's dungeon for decades. Apart from him, there's also another descendant of the Lord that created everything, the omnipotent and omniscient God, named Adam. What did Adam inherit in the beginning? Does he still have a descendant alive, and if so, where would he be? What's the relationship between the true creator and that person? Is it simply an imitation by using the creator's title and the symbol of the cross? Or is there some deeper connection between the two? Klein didn't let his doubts show too much. After all, the magic mirror, Erodes, could be sizing him up. Horamek stared at the mural for a while, then he suddenly took a few steps forward and pressed his extended palms against the wall. Without a sound, the majestic mural disintegrated, turning into pieces of stone fragments that landed on the ground. Even the color quickly evaporated, disappearing without a trace. The Church of the God of Steam and Machinery is consciously concealing the history of the third and fourth epochs. Are the other churches the same? Klein frowned and followed the Horamek doll to the other side. After making a half circle, they discovered another thing. A stone door, which only had an outline, loomed in the corner. At this moment, the Horamek doll's joints were constantly creaking, but this didn't stop him from quickly approaching the stone door and reaching out with his right hand to attempt to push. Above the stone door, there was a sudden burst of aqueous light that condensed into a scene that looked so real that it seemed possible to directly touch it. Dark blue waves were surging forward, and there was a dense black mist that looked like liquid. A craggy mountain protruded from the mist, continuously flowing with viscous liquids. Behind this mountain, the black mist seemed endless, with no end in sight. There was also no limit to its depth. The deeper one looked, the more placid it felt. It was as if once something fell in, it would fall forever. What is this place? Klein's expression didn't change as he muttered inwardly. Horamek retracted his palms and watched as the scene gradually faded until it disappeared. He leaned his head back and sighed to himself while feeling perplexed. The abyss? Abyss? That's the source of all corruption. It's said that it's an abyss that can even corrupt a true god? Klein was amazed, but as a former clown, he regulated his expression and limbs to appear unperturbed. He immediately thought of something. Roussel, who was exploring the Fog Sea, had once deviated from his path, leaving behind a puzzling sentence: "I saw the abyss." As Klein pondered about the layers of waves that were surging towards the black fog, he made a conjecture. There's an entrance to the abyss somewhere in the Fog Sea? Immediately after, he looked towards the stone door. He suspected that Aemon, who lurked around the City of Silver, had employed a certain ritual. After finishing the tomb, he didn't depart from it normally. Instead, he used a special tunnel to head for the abyss. Thus, in the eyes of most people, he was already dead. As for whether the City of Silver or the Forsaken Land of the Gods was located somewhere in the abyss, Klein couldn't be sure. After all, the history of this tomb was at least 1500 years old, so Aemon had plenty of time to use the abyss to go somewhere else. Would he still occasionally come back to siphon off time? If he finds out that someone has dug up his grave, the expression on his face would definitely be very marvelous. Klein rejoiced for a baffling reason. At this moment, the Horamic doll held his left hand in his right palm and abruptly twisted it. With a creaking sound, his left hand was bent at the wrist, but there were no bones that pierced out of his skin, spewing out flesh and blood. There was a heavy, black metal tube inlaid in his left wrist. His entire left arm was a small-caliber mystical cannon. To hide a mole of advanced technology, he truly is worthy of being from the machinery hivemind. However, the requirements and costs for such a thing are too high. Clearly, it could only be provided to specific personnel and not for military troops. Klein felt that today was an eye-opener for him, an opportunity to see another development path in the mysterious world. The only problem is that Beyonder characteristics are conserved, artisans are limited, so many things cannot be mass-produced. The Horamic doll put his left wrist against the stone door. Inside his body, the sound of gears grinding against each other as they revolved emitted an intense spirituality radiance. A ray of light that was as bright as day appeared and disappeared. The stone door suddenly turned into pure powder, as if it had never existed. He destroyed the door? If blasphemer Aemon encounters an emergency situation and attempts to return here, only to find the door gone, that would be fun. Klein almost laughed when he imagined that scene. This was the end of the Aemon family's tomb exploration. The scene surrounding Klein quickly shrank and became the background. An illusory, ancient, and bizarre silver mirror appeared in midair. The black, eye-like gemstones on the mirror flickered. White words were quickly outlined in the mirror. Your loyal servant, Erodes, has finished reporting and is ready to serve you at any time again. Klein was a bit wary and unaccustomed towards the fellow who appeared too enthusiastic. He nodded and said, "Well done, you may leave first." Yes, the mighty existence above the spirit world. As soon as Erodes produced that line of words, the scene around him shattered into pieces. After confirming that its power had left his dream, Klein thoughtfully said to himself, the mighty existence above the spirit world? It really has vaguely sensed the grey fog. Does this magic mirror with a wicked sense of humor really wish to rely on me, or does it have some other purpose? I have to watch carefully. Otherwise, with it at the machinery hivemind, I don't want to be repeatedly blasted with cannon fire. Rounding up his thoughts, Klein began looking forward to the next day. After the machinery hivemind tidied up their spoils, they were likely to get him to choose an item. In Empress Burrow, inside the opulent villa of Earl Hall, the cold air was kept out by the windows and walls. The building's interior was warm as though it were spring, and the fireplace was elegant. Audrey Hall was having her measurements taken by the fashion designer, Mrs. Guinea, so that she could create a costume for Audrey for the New Year banquet in consideration of her recent physical and emotional state. At this moment, her personal maid, Annie, came close to her ear and whispered, "Lady Escalante is here." Such a fast response? Audrey was delighted, but she didn't make an obvious show of it on her face. With a faint smile, she said, "Please get her to wait in my art studio." For 5 minutes. Art studio? Annie asked in surprise. Yes, I'd like to ask her to admire my recently completed oil painting. She says that content that is painted in a relaxed state easily allows one to express their true thoughts and emotions, Audrey explained unhurriedly. Annie suddenly felt enlightened. Yes, miss. Less than 5 minutes later, Audrey entered the studio and saw Escalante admiring the paintings on the walls. That's Mr. Sensi's Inner Heart's Night, a masterpiece that allows one to feel peace. She smiled and introduced the painting to Escalante. Sensi's Inner Heart's Night? One of the top 10 works of last year's top 100 century-old paintings that the Tussock Times voted for? Escalante was obviously the kind of person who often read newspapers. And as a Beyander of the spectator pathway, she had a good memory. Yes, Audrey replied simply, as though it was a trivial matter. I actually have the honor of seeing the real deal. Escalante looked up at the painting again. She swallowed back the words, this is worth at least a manor, unwilling to appear too Philistine. Audrey didn't continue introducing the other paintings. She found a reason to send Annie away and motioned to Susie to stand guard outside the door. Susie read her hint without any hindrance, wagged her tail, and scampered out. Escalante closed the door and went back to the easel's side. Before Audrey could ask, she took the initiative and said, we have both the human skin shadows characteristic and the wind-blessed potion formula. However, there is no need for us to sell it unless the other party is able to provide an irresistible offer. The willingness to negotiate means there's hope. Audrey's green eyes darted slightly as she asked with a chuckle, what do you wish to receive in exchange? Escalante stroked her hair and gave her pre-prepared answer. £2,500 for the human skin shadow characteristic, and £3,000 for the wind-blessed potion formula. Quite a huge premium. Although Audrey didn't find them expensive, she lamented the fact that the Psychology Alchemist's premium had exceeded 50%. According to the description given by the Hanged Man, under normal circumstances, the formula for sequence 6 would have cost less than £2,000, but the closer it was to a high sequence, the fewer potion formulas there were to circulate, making it very difficult to buy them. There was no normal situation, and what was even more important was that even if one chanced upon a sale, it was very difficult to ascertain their authenticity. At that moment, Escalante added, if the other party can barter with mystical items, all that's needed is for them to be of roughly the same value. That is to say, you want mystical items more and can accept a price reduction for them. The Psychology Alchemists is one of the youngest secret organizations. They clearly haven't accumulated enough in this area compared to the others. Audrey pursed her lips and said, I'll inform them, but I can't guarantee that they'll accept it. She wasn't the least bit worried that the Psychology Alchemist would notice that she hadn't been involved in any Beyander gathering recently. After all, her schedule was rather tight. Afternoon tea, music lessons, dinners, dances, equestrian training, language lessons, dancing lessons, and so on. There were too many opportunities for her to interact with different people. In that case, perhaps a particular dinner was a cover for Beyander gatherings, or perhaps the music teacher was a senior Beyander, and it was almost impossible for the Psychology Alchemists, who hid in the shadows, to investigate it when they couldn't act openly. Having said this, Audrey curiously asked, Ms. Escalante, I thought you wouldn't sell the wind-blessed potion formula since it's already at sequence 6. Heh, if there's a chance, it might be more useful to spread this information out, Escalante answered vaguely. In her mind, although Miss Audrey was a new member who had a high level of importance attached to her by the organization, she was still a new member after all. There were many things she couldn't know about. Why? Audrey suppressed her doubts and smiled sweetly. She asked innocently, Ms. Escalante, if this deal succeeds, can you count it as my contribution? Escalante broke into a laugh. Yes. Ellipsis. Klein busied all morning, until he returned to Minsk Street. He filled his stomach and prepared to rest. Only then did he have the time and opportunity to listen to prayers above the grey fog. Someone on Miss Justice's side has the human skin shadow characteristic? Seriously? Either it doesn't come, or it comes in pairs. As a secret organization, the Psychology Alchemists is quite qualified in the field of resources. Klein was suddenly left in the throes of happiness from having a choice. Even if he counted the £500 which the Hanged Man still hadn't paid him, he only had £1,335 in cash. This didn't prevent him from seriously considering the request for a deal with the Psychology Alchemists. After thinking for a dozen seconds or so, he passed Justice's words to the Hanged Man to see what choice the latter would make. £3,000? Alger Wilson, who was still in Rorstad Archipelago's capital, the city of generosity, felt as if someone had struck him hard. After he became captain of the Blue Avenger, he sometimes played the role of a pirate and sometimes a law enforcer, secretly exterminating several groups of pirates. But even so, the total value of his spoils of war didn't exceed £2,000, and a portion of it had to be distributed to the sailors under him. Of course, this didn't include the ships and cannons which were captured, as they had to be handed over to the Church of the Lord of Storms. This made Alger often sigh that most pirates weren't rich, that they were used to squandering on having opulent lives. Liquor, barbecue, whores, marijuana, and gambling had drained the pirates of their money. Unless I meet a pirate crew with Beyonders, it would be very difficult to get rich so suddenly. Alger paced a few steps, then he made up his mind. He took out a gold mask from his undergarment pocket. The mask had rough facial features, and the way they were formed had the characteristics of a primitive human being from an ancient forest. Alger sat down, humbly recited the honorific name of the fool, and said, "I'm willing to use this mystical item to barter for the wind-blessed potion formula. As long as the user wears this mask, they will become extremely calm and emotionless. At the same time, they will also obtain an extremely strong regenerative ability, exaggerated speed, and outstanding strength, as well as grasp a certain amount of black magic and primitive curse techniques. Its weakness is that as the number of times it's used increases, the wearer will become more and more unlike a human being. They will turn colder and colder, eventually treating themselves as a god." Ellipsis. Sitting in his seat as the fool, Klein looked at the 500-pound note in front of him, the 5 strands of dark blue hair as thick as a tiny snake, and the simple golden mask. He tapped the edge of the long table with his finger, thinking carefully about what mystical items he could use for a trade. The all-black eye? Certainly not. This is the main ingredient of a Sequence 5 Nimblewright Master. It's just short of having Little Sun to obtain the method to remove the mental corruption. Dark Emperor card? This card, which cannot see the light of day, has a value countless times higher than that of a human skin shadow's characteristic. Mr. Azek's copper whistle? At the moment, its only function is the summoning of a messenger, and it's an important tool for communication. I can't sell it. The copper whistle of the numinous episcopate member who left behind white feathers. Similarly, it can only summon a messenger, but the target on the other side of the messenger seems to be very dangerous. Sun brooch? This is something I want to use for myself. It effectively makes up for my weaknesses. Master key? It involves Mr. Door and has too many hidden secrets. In addition, just from the value of its effects, it pales in comparison to the human skin shadow's characteristic. Biological poison bottle? This is very compatible with my spirit body state. If I use it well, I can even fight a group of Beyonders. Demon hunting bullets? Purifying bullets? Exorcism bullets? There are not mystical items and are considered consumable Beyonder weapons. They are of very low value. The Book of Secrets? This isn't a mystical item either. The psychology alchemists likely do not lack such knowledge. At present, only the Beyonder characteristic of an interrogator can be sold. However, the psychology alchemists wants mystical items. Furthermore, the trading venue is in Backland, so it would easily expose information pertaining to Hero Bandit Dark Emperor. Klein took this opportunity to sort out what he had and finally came up with a perfect plan. He first took the form of Mr. World, manipulating him to take up a praying posture, and then he responded with a hoarse voice, "I accept the price of £2,500, but give me 2 days to raise the money." Immediately following that, Klein threw the reply scenes of the Hanged Man and the World to the Crimson Star, which symbolized Miss Justice. After receiving affirmation from Miss Justice, Klein waited patiently all afternoon at Minsk Street. It was late afternoon when the Machinery Hivemind member, Carlson, rang his doorbell. Klein didn't ask anything further. He followed the man to the Lever Cathedral near the West Balam dock and entered a 3-story building next to the cathedral. The signboard wrote, Backland Institute for Mechanical Research. How academic. Klein suddenly thought of the Blackthorn Security Company and cracked the corner of his lips into a smile. Under Carlson's guidance, he passed through some strange devices and found himself in a windowless room. On the long table in the room, there were many items emitting strong spirituality, including the human skin shadow characteristic and the specter portrait frame, which was covered in black cloth. However, there were no characteristics left behind by the dead Beyonders. Obviously, the higher-ups of the Machinery Hivemind don't want me to know about the law of indestructibility and conservation. Klein wasn't the least bit surprised. You can choose one. The hatless Ikanzer pointed at the long table. Klein scrutinized the items several times before sighing. There's nothing I want. If I were to convert it into gold, how much would I get? He had already made up his mind that he wouldn't obtain the human skin shadow's characteristic from the Machinery Hivemind. Although this could be explained as the need to create some mystical item or to try out a unique ritualistic magic, there was still a chance of exposing his own sequence. In a situation where there was a better choice, Klein didn't want to take the risk. Thus, he intended to take only money. Not only would this help him gather the £2,500 that the psychology alchemists quoted, but he could also effectively dispel the Machinery Hivemind's wariness towards him. Ikanzer was visibly relieved. He smoothed his hair and answered with a smile, £1,500. However, we encourage you to choose money, so a total of £2,000. Klein immediately revealed a sincere smile. All right. With the help of a bestowment ritual, Klein handed £2,500 in cash and the gold mask provided by the Hanged Man to Miss Justice, and he used the image of the world to urge her to close the deal as soon as possible. I've spent almost £5,000 in the past 2 weeks. If I didn't leave Tingen, this amount of money is enough for me to maintain a lifestyle just like my landlady's family. A doll ruins one's life. Consuming potions bankrupts you for 3 generations less than sup greater than 1 less than sup greater than. Klein looked at the vast fog and the ancient palace, which had returned to silence. He was a little upset, as though he had lost something important. He was quiet for a few seconds before returning to the real world. He picked up the remaining £830 on his desk, and he counted out 6 £5 notes. Then, Klein put the £30 of cash in his now deflated wallet and stuffed it solemnly into the inside pocket of his clothes. He divided the other £800 into 2 stacks, placing 1 stack in each of his side pockets. After that, Klein opened the drawer and took out 2 of the 5 deep-sea Naga hair strands that he had brought back to the real world. He wrapped them in layers after layers of paper and carefully put them into his pocket. When he was done, he took his hat and cane, and he headed for the street corner under the glow of the street lamps at night. He got on a carriage and headed for the Bravehearts bar in the Backland Bridge area. In the heated and noisy environment, Klein insisted on finishing his glass of Southwell beer before he slowly made his way out of the bar and into a rental carriage through the thundering cheers for the boxers. Taking in the rumbling of the wheels, he intentionally closed his eyes. Suddenly, he heard the sound of the window being lightly tapped. Klein's facial muscles twitched slightly as he opened his eyes and looked in front of him. He saw the pale and exquisite Miss Sharon sitting quietly across him. Without waiting for her to question him, Klein smiled and said, "I sold the information you gave me last time for a good price, the one about the Amen family tomb." Sharon looked at him silently. Leaning his cane to the side, Klein took out 2 stacks of cash and a small clump of paper from his pocket. £800 plus 2 strands of deep-sea Naga hair, for a total of about £1,000. That's what you deserve. Klein took a silent breath and smiled as he handed over the cash and paper clump. Sharon glanced at him and reached out her hand to take both items. She lowered her head, looked at the items in her hand, and asked in an ethereal voice, "How much did you sell it for?" £2,000, so we split it equally. Klein chuckled. If the machinery hivemind had only paid me £1,500 according to the original plan, then I'll have to first owe you a portion of it, he thought gladly. With a flip of Sharon's bloodless hand, the cash and the paper clump disappeared without a trace. She raised her head and tersely acknowledged before asking succinctly, "What's in the tomb?" "I don't know, I didn't go." Klein didn't disclose the help he had received from the magic mirror, or Rhodes. For an instant, he felt that if he described the experience in detail, Miss Sharon would have listened attentively with one hand on her cheek, as she had done before. This Wraith lady seems to have a hobby of watching situational scenes and dramas or listening to all kinds of rumors. Klein summed up. Sharon's expression didn't change. After a few seconds of silence, she said, "Someone is digging a tunnel to the underground ruin." Huh? Klein wasn't able to react for a moment to what Sharon was talking about. However, he soon understood which underground ruin Sharon was referring to. There was only one underground ruin the two of them knew of, and that was the 4th epic Tudor dynasty ruin. Someone is digging their way into the underground structure? Klein pondered for a few seconds, then he suddenly came to a realization. Is it that baronet? He had already forgotten the name of the hidden Tudor dynasty descendant, other than knowing that he had an aristocratic title of a baronet and that he lived on Civilaw Street where the Backland police station was located. Yes. Sharon gave him a positive answer. What is he looking for? Doesn't he know that there's an evil spirit inside? Doesn't he know that all the Beyonders from his family died in there? Klein asked himself a few questions. Sharon sat up straight and replied seriously, "I don't know if he knows or not." Quote ellipsis. How much longer will he take to dig through? Klein asked in deliberation. Another 2 to 3 months, for the time being, he's doing it on his own. Sharon provided her own judgment. Phew. Klein let out a small sigh. There's no need to rush. When I'm ready, then we can go visit him together. At this point, he explained with a smile, "As you know, I like to make sufficient preparations in advance. I won't get involved in anything until I advance to Faceless." He warned himself inwardly. All right. Sharon didn't ask him what he was going to do, but her figure faded quickly, and she disappeared from the carriage. Klein leaned back against the wall, feeling relaxed. The ingredients for the faceless potion has been reserved, and I'm just waiting for the delivery. My debts have all been paid off, so there's nothing to worry about. His mood was like a fizzy wine that had settled. Occasionally, there would be a little bit of joy that would silently surge upwards. The only problem is, Klein touched his left breast, where there was a shriveled wallet. He sighed and said to himself silently, only £30 in cash, 5 gold coins, and some change. Thursday afternoon. Audrey Hall was waiting in the study for the arrival of Miss Escalante. After receiving the Hanged Man's and the World's replies, she had immediately sent a servant to send a letter to Escalante. The content of the letter was very ordinary. Audrey hoped that the second psychology class this week would be brought forward to Thursday. In reality, Audrey had already made an agreement with Escalante. Once she expressed such an intention, it would mean that the other party had agreed to the conditions. Tick. Tock. The wall clock on the wall moved briskly, and Escalante with her waist-reaching long hair entered the room with several teaching materials in hand. Audrey immediately gave Susie a look. The big golden retriever somewhat reluctantly leapt out, lay down in the nearby shadows, and observed the people coming and going. Escalante closed the study door, looked around slowly, then sat down across the small white round table and put down the teaching materials. Are they paying for it in cash, or with some kind of mystical item? This member of the Psychology Alchemists asked in a low voice. One directly gave £2,500, and one provided a mystical item. Audrey flippantly took out a white cardboard box from her medium-sized orange handbag. The outside of the box was covered with a wall of spirituality. After removing the wall of spirituality, she opened the lid of the box, revealing the simple golden mask. Then, she recounted the flaws and effects of the mask. To be honest, she was very curious when she received the mystical item. She had wished to test its effects since it was her first time coming into contact with a mystical item. However, she finally resisted her urges, as she didn't wish to turn cold. It's basically the same value. Escalante tried it and breathed a sigh of relief. After 2 seconds, she pulled out the thickest textbook and flipped to page 48. The middle part of the textbook had been hollowed out. There was an iron box about the size of a palm and a rolled-up piece of parchment. Human skin shadow characteristic. Wind-blessed potion formula. Escalante showed and introduced them to her. Audrey's gaze cast towards the characteristic which resembled a diamond. The face inside left her head spinning. This has the ability to restrain a spectator's powers. Is this the sequence pathway of Mr. World? No wonder. Audrey looked away and studied the formula. Sequence 6. Wind-blessed. Main ingredients. 6 crystalline feathers of a blue shadow falcon, a pair of dragon-eyed sea condor eyes. Before Audrey could examine the supplementary ingredients, Escalante rolled up the parchment in time. After that, she set up the wall of spirituality around the metal box again, closed the textbook, and pushed the thick book towards Audrey. Audrey held the book, but she didn't hand over the gold mask and £2,500 to Escalante in a timely manner. Seeing the look of puzzlement in Escalante's eyes, the prepared Audrey smiled and said, the other party is worried that the characteristic doesn't match and that the formula is fake. They hope to verify it first. And before the verification, the money and items will all be held under my custody. All of them believe in my trustworthiness, and I do not wish to lose this reputation. I understand their concerns. Escalante paused for a moment before saying, we trust you, too. Since the money and items were in the hands of one of her own members, she wasn't worried about being cheated despite feeling upheavals. Besides, Miss Audrey is rich and powerful. She can be trusted to be a guarantor. Escalante thought with relief. In the ancient palace above the fog, Klein held a spirit pendulum in hand, divining the authenticity of the wind-blessed potion formula. He didn't wish to inadvertently lose the most experienced and powerful member of the Tarot Club, Mr. Hanged Man. When he opened his eyes and saw the topaz pendant turning clockwise, Klein heaved a sigh of relief and sent his thoughts to the crimson star that symbolized the Hanged Man. City of Generosity. Alger first saw the endless grey fog before hearing Mr. Fool's low but distant voice. Miss Justice has completed the deal. An illusory piece of parchment appeared in front of Alger. On it was the wind-blessed potion formula. With the potion going through Mr. Fool's hands, he had no qualms about the authenticity of the formula. He bowed his head respectfully and thanked him. When the illusion dissipated, he immediately found a pen and paper to jot down the potion formula. Then, he paced back and forth in excitement, muttering to himself, Blue Shadow Falcon. That primitive island has it. After finishing the matter regarding the Hanged Man, Klein finally had the time to check his human skin shadow characteristic. After confirming its authenticity, he relaxed and leaned back in his chair, exhaling happily. Finally, after 3 seconds, Klein suddenly sat up, and he decided that there was no time to lose. Tonight, he would concoct the faceless potion. 1. Generations. This is a meme in Chinese, where the doll and consuming potions change depending on the joke. 15 Minsk Street, in the dank, cold kitchen. Klein rummaged for his newly bought large iron pot, poured fresh water into it, and carefully scrubbed it several times. Then, he dropped some matches into it and snapped his fingers. The scarlet flames soared, and under his control, they quickly burned the remaining water droplets dry, without harming the surface of the pot. This time, there were no ingredients such as pure water in the potion recipe, so Klein was even more careful than the previous 2 times. He wanted to ensure that everything was in good measure to prevent any problems. Although he was able to divine whether the concoction would be successful or not, at least to not endanger his life, such a result could still involve his potion being ineffective. Attempting to extract the Byander characteristics from the concoction would be relatively difficult, just like the removal of the mental corruption of a rampager. He would need the corresponding technique, methods, or rituals, and Klein wouldn't be able to gather a second round of ingredients within a short period of time either. After finishing his preparations, Klein took a deep breath as he looked at the neatly arranged boxes. Finally, he recalled the potion recipe. Faceless. Main ingredients: mutated pituitary gland of a thousand-faced hunter, characteristic of a human skin shadow. Supplementary ingredients: 80 ml of a thousand-faced hunter's blood, 5 drops of black jimsonweed juice, 10 grams of dragontooth grass powder, 3 strands of hair from a deep-sea naga. He first picked up the cardboard box which came from Vampire Emlyn White. He opened the box and took out the glass bottle that contained 100 ml of a thousand-faced hunter's blood. Glancing at the scale, Klein unscrewed the lid and steadily poured the sticky liquid into the pot with a stable wrist. The liquid changed its color depending on the variation in the lighting. As it was a supplementary ingredient, he didn't pursue precision and didn't use chemical experiment apparatus to separate and titrate the liquid. The thousand-faced hunter's blood was like thin honey that slowly filled the bottom of the pot. When Klein felt that it was about time, he stopped tilting it and allowed the liquid to flow back. There's still about 20 milliliters left. My spiritual intuition is quite accurate. Klein withdrew his gaze from the glass bottle and tightened the lid. This 20 milliliters of thousand-faced hunter's blood could still be used to make mystical items, Byander weapons, extraordinary scrolls, or for drawing symbols or labels in some ritualistic magic. It was still very precious. After putting the glass bottle back into the cotton-filled box, Klein went down the list and added the black jimsonweed juice and the dragontooth grass powder. He saw that the liquid in the iron pot started to bubble. Without pausing, he picked up 3 strands of dark blue hair that resembled tiny snakes with his black-gloved right hand, and he firmly placed them on the surface of the liquid. Sizzle! A faint mist rose from the iron pot, and the color of the liquid turned a deep blue. It already has such a strange effect even without adding the main ingredients. As expected of a Sequence 6 potion, Klein reached out and grabbed the silver tin box which Vampire Emlyn White had thrown in as well. With a snapping sound, Klein opened the lid of the box, revealing a peach-like item inside. He didn't directly touch the thousand-faced hunter's mutated pituitary gland. Instead, he placed the tin box over the top of the pot and overturned it. A yellow-brown object with the grooves and ridges of a brain fell in, crashing into the dark blue liquid. At this moment, no liquid droplets splashed up, and the pituitary gland that was constantly changing its shape silently melted. The colors of gray and yellowish-brown quickly merged with the dark blue, and the bubbling suddenly increased in size. At this point, Klein was a little nervous, but he controlled himself. He picked up the last box and overturned the huge diamond-like human skin shadow characteristic into the pot. All of a sudden, the mist converged, and even the glow of the gas lamps showed signs of being attracted and devoured as the room turned darker. When everything returned to normal, Klein finally saw what the final potion looked like. It was blackish-green all over, and from time to time, it would produce a bubble the size of an eye, and as if it had a life of its own, it would produce a burping sound every few seconds. When the bubble reached the surface, it would immediately burst, and during this process, it would reflect light in a myriad of colors. The colors combined to form a picture of different faces, and the facial features seemed to be a random combination. Klein picked up the iron pot with one hand and poured the liquid inside into a glass bottle that he had prepared beforehand. Because of a potion's characteristics, not one bit was left in the pot. Using divination to confirm that the degree of harm was acceptable, which meant that the potion had been successfully concocted, Klein took the faceless potion bottle and walked steadily back to the second floor, entering the room with the curtains closed. After locking the door, he sat on the edge of the bed and, with the help of cogitation, calmed his slightly agitated and anxious mood. After sitting upright for more than 10 seconds, Klein twisted the cap off of the bottle, raised his right hand, and swiftly poured the entire potion into his mouth. A slightly tingling sensation swished in his mouth and esophagus, and finally, it fermented into a numbing sensation that made him lose his senses. Klein's psyche seemed to be extracted from his body as he had the feeling of being a bystander and saw his mouth, nose, ears, and eyes melting. His entire face was melting. In just 2 or 3 seconds, his face and head had turned into what seemed like scorched white wax. His body was similarly abnormal. It was as if his bones and skin were being melted by blood. No, I can't allow such a situation to continue developing. Klein knew that if he didn't keep it under control, he could be on the verge of losing control at any moment. As a spectator, he tried his best to pull his thoughts back to his body, trying to visualize the layers of stacked spherical lights and maintain his state of cogitation. After a brief but repeated attempt, he finally felt his body once again. He tried his best to control every tiny part of his body to hold onto his lower limit. As the melting and dissolving assaulted him again and again, Klein lost sense of how long he held on for, but when it finally came to an end, he regained the feeling that his body belonged to him. At that moment, he knew that he had finally broken through the threshold and was now a Sequence 6. He was now a faceless. Klein didn't sweat, but he was mentally exhausted. He barely got to his feet and walked to the full-length mirror, trying to observe what he looked like. Under the gas lamp's illumination, he took 2 sudden steps back and caused the floor to reverberate. The scene in the mirror was extremely shocking. Klein saw that his face and exposed skin were covered with dense, pale granules. It would make any normal creature who saw those go numb and subconsciously resist. The more timid ones might even lose their mind. Despite knowing the acting method, and having completely digested the magician potion, my advancement to Sequence 6 was still rather difficult. I was only 2 to 3 steps away from losing control. I wonder how much a risk those beyonders who relied on the accumulation of time and barely qualified to consume the potion faced. The probability of failure definitely isn't low. It's no wonder Sequence 7 is relatively common among the members of the churches, and they will shoulder the responsibility of captain or bishop, while the number of people at Sequence 6 begins to plummet. Klein closed his eyes and sat back in his chair. With the help of cogitation, he was able to restrain his overflowing spirituality and recover from his exhaustion. After about 10 minutes, the disgusting granules on his body had completely faded and merged into his flesh. Phew! Klein exhaled, walked back to the full-length mirror, and he looked at his full bearded appearance. Suddenly, his facial hair began to squirm. His flesh and skin began to undergo a bizarre change like half-melted wax. Within a second or two, Klein had reverted to his original appearance. Black hair, brown eyes, ordinary facial features, a clean face with a deep outline, and a somewhat thin body. He quietly gazed at his past self and stretched out his right hand to press it against his face. With a gentle touch, Klein's face changed again. His nose bridge was high, his lips were extremely thin, and there was a tinge of elegance in his handsome face. There was an unconcealable pride in his appearance. It was none other than vampire Emlyn White. A little too short. He laughed at himself. At this moment, the bones and ligaments in his body began to produce cracking and snapping sounds as his entire body suddenly soared up a little. He now looked identical to Emlyn White, externally. I've noticed that I can accurately recall the exterior appearance and temperament of every person I know, and I can grasp their unique scent. Klein's pores squirmed, and his body changed accordingly. The smell of his body became different as a result of this. He looked into the full-length mirror again, letting his hairline slowly recede, and he changed the color of his eyes into a deep gray. Without a sound, Dunn Smith seemed to come alive again, and he was staring at the team member who always came to him to report on unusual matters. Letting out a breath, Klein returned to his original form, but the corners of his mouth remained curled upwards. He thought for a moment, took a few steps back, and looked at the magazine, Ladies' Aesthetics, which he had bought to look at fashionable beauties, and he noted down the appearance of the actress on the cover. Then, he went back to the full-length mirror and wiped his face with his right hand. When he looked in the mirror again, he saw a young lady with black hair that went past her shoulders and delicate facial features. It really works. Klein looked down at his chest, but he didn't see any protrusions. Trying hard to control his body, he managed to create a pair of cups by moving his fat and some of his flesh. However, there was nothing he could do about his lower body. That is to say, it is just a superficial change in appearance, nothing fundamental. Also, I can only grow taller or shorter by 10 centimeters at the moment. Going beyond this range would be difficult. Also, there's a limit to the enlargement and shrinkage of the head. For example, I can't mimic Father Utroski's half-giant head at all. Also, I can only observe the appearance and temperament of the target in an instant, without knowing anything related to him. It's easy for me to be exposed when facing a spectator like Miss Justice. Heh. In the clown stage, the clown restrains the spectator, but in the faceless stage, it is actually somewhat restrained by the spectator. Interesting. Upon having this thought, Klein stopped changing and returned to the appearance of Sherlock Moriarty. Divination, fighting, as well as a magician's Beyonder powers, have all been enhanced. As for how much they've improved, it can only be confirmed through practice. I should find some time to head to the Quelaag Club tomorrow. Klein took one last look and went downstairs to clear up the mess. After rounding up everything, he quickly washed up and crawled into bed. Lying there, looking out the window at the crimson moonlight, he gradually calmed down. After a few minutes of this, Klein slowly closed his eyes and smiled to himself. Good night, Faceless. Townsend Street, in between Empress Borough and West Borough. Zio de Recha was standing in a dark, secluded alley. Even without looking up, she could see the countless magnificent palaces and tall Gothic towers in the distance. It was the highest district in the whole of Backland, and it was also where the Lowen royal family resided. It shared the same or even slightly higher status as the White Maple Palace of Intis and the Ormir Palace of the Faesac Empire in the southern and northern continent and in the entire world, but its name was neither romantic nor ancient. It was called the Sodella Palace, and in ancient Faesac, it meant balance. Zio looked away from the famous Bell of Order, and directed her sight to the other side of the alley. In the shadows where the street lamps didn't shine, a figure slowly walked out. The figure wore a golden mask that revealed the lower half of his face. He was none other than the mysterious person who had previously sold the sheriff formula to Zio and had occasionally entrusted her with some tasks. When Zio and Furs discussed in private, they both suspected that the person was from MI9. Any progress this week? The man wearing the gold mask asked as per usual. Zio shook her head. No, I don't think anyone was keeping tabs on Capum before the incident. She paused for a moment, then she reluctantly asked, do you still want to continue investigating this matter? The masked man was silent for a moment. There's no need, but if you hear anything related in the future, then contact me right away. Today, I'll give you a new mission. What mission? Zio was completely in her bounty hunter state, ready to assess the risks. The masked guy laughed. This is a very simple mission, and it's one that you've been dreaming of doing. Seek to purchase the sheriff and interrogator main ingredients in all your circles, especially a special ingredient that can be directly concocted into a potion. If someone responds to it, we will pay for it. The purchased ingredients will belong to me? Zio blurted out a response. This was her greatest concern. No, do you believe that such a simple mission would have such a high reward? Of course, if you're able to fish out the person we're looking for, it's not impossible to negotiate and let you obtain the main ingredients, the masked man said with a chuckle. But I don't know the main ingredients of the interrogator potion. Zio hesitantly said, I'll tell you later. This is also our advance payment. Even if we don't find the target, you'll have the main portion of a Sequence 7 potion formula, worth more than £600. I think you're fully aware of our generosity, the masked man said in a bewitching tone. Generous indeed. Who's their target, and why are they willing to pay such a high price to find them? Well, if he were from MI9, taking advantage of this mission to retrieve the Beyonder ingredients of the Arbiter pathway on the market should also be one of his goals. There's no problem about wasting money. As quite an experienced bounty hunter, Zio instinctively thought of a few things. After some deliberation, she nodded and said, I'll take this commission. Very good. The masked man's tone turned relaxed as he surveyed his surroundings and said, the interrogator potion's main ingredients are the horn of a flash-patterned black snake and dust of a lake spirit. After saying that, he slowly retreated and melded into the shadows, disappearing into the corner of the alley. He really told me the main ingredients of the interrogator potion. Zio was momentarily stunned. Only at that point did she clearly realize how much importance the Masked Man's faction placed on this mission. I wonder who their target is. It seems to be focused on some special ingredient that can be used to directly concoct a sheriff or interrogator potion. With this in mind, Zio suddenly froze up. She remembered one thing. When she advanced to sheriff, she had used a special ingredient she had bought through Furs, one that could be used to concoct the corresponding potion. Is that their target? Zio instinctively decided to keep silent on this matter, to never tell the Masked Man anything. She rubbed her fat baby cheeks and walked towards the street outside, ready to take a public carriage back to Cherwood Borough. At that moment, she saw a brown carriage drive past. Her eyes were instantly attracted by the coat of arms on the carriage. The coat of arms consisted of a single flower and 2 rings. There was nothing special about it, but Zio stared at it in a daze as though her gaze had frozen. It was only when the carriage was far away, did she withdraw her gaze. Her mood immediately reached rock bottom. It didn't turn for the better, even when she returned to the shared rented house. Seeing that her friend was in a bad mood, Furs poured 2 glasses of red wine and brought them to her. What happened? She sat across her and pushed one of the glasses toward Zio. Zio looked down at the red wine. After a full 2 minutes of silence, she said in a slightly hoarse voice, "On the way back, I met someone I used to know." "Who?" Furs asked, cooperatively. "Viscount Stratford," Zio replied to any question she received without elaborating. Furs thought for a moment and then she said, "This Viscount seems to be the captain of the Royal Guards?" As a best-selling novel author, she would receive invitations from noblemen who liked literature and participated in afternoon tea parties and banquets from time to time. With her professional habits of collecting material as a writer, she would certainly volunteer to understand more famous noblemen. It was at such a party that she got to know Viscount Glaint. "Yes, he used to be my father's deputy," Zio said with some difficulty. "Your father?" Furs knew that Zio came from a fallen aristocratic family and had some secrets. However, she didn't know the specifics. Zio picked up the glass of red wine and gulped it down, coughing a few times after she choked. After calming herself down, she said, "My family was once part of the aristocracy. In its heyday, it even served as an Earl Palatine." "Earl Palatine? What position is that?" Furs asked, half curious, half trying to soothe her friend's mood. "It's equivalent to being the spokesperson for the royal family, nobles that are the closest to the throne," Zio said in recollection, her face jubilant. "From that moment forth, our family had the fief a true earl would have, but it wasn't as illustrious during the time of my father. However, we still held the trust of the former king, Might Wielder William VI. He was the leader of the Household Guards Division and the captain of the Royal Guards." Her tone gradually turned melancholic as she found it difficult to hide her pain. "But 7 years ago, he was accused of participating in a revolt, and he was eventually executed and deprived of his aristocratic title and fiefdom. Because of this, my family fell from grace, and many of my family members even died for no reason. In order to live, we changed our surnames and left East Tucker County. I don't believe that my father would engage in mutiny. He was so loyal to the royal family, even more so than his belief in the goddess. Anyway, I left my mother and my younger brother and came to Backland, looking for a chance to improve myself, hoping to restore my family's glory and my father's reputation." Zio was vague about some of the things midway through her recount, but Furs didn't mind. She sighed and said, "It'll be very, very difficult." But she immediately smiled. "But I will support you. And behind me is the mysterious Tarot Club," she added in her mind. Nighttime in Tingan City, 2 Daffodil Street. Melissa, who was doing math problems, turned her head to the door and looked at Benson, who had just taken off his half-top hat. "Where did you go? Aren't the results announced tomorrow?" "They're already available tonight, and I happen to know 2 of the city's employees who are in charge of the unified exam," Benson said with a smirk. In early December, he had enrolled for the Civil Servant Unified Examination, selected a relatively incompetitive position, and, in the process, established friendships with several civil servants and a number of examination candidates through his eloquence and communication skills. What was the result? Melissa unconsciously put down the fountain pen in her hand. Benson's expression immediately darkened, but before Melissa could open her mouth, he revealed a bright smile. "I passed. And I'm ranked quite high." "That's great." Melissa stood up and took 2 steps forward. "You have to start preparing for the second round of exams at the end of January. It's held in Backland. I need to prepare your luggage for you ahead of time. When are you planning on leaving?" Seeing his sister's concern, Benson walked into the living room, smiled and said, I plan to do so after the new year. We'll go to Backland together and rent a house there. Regardless of the success of the exam, I'm prepared to stay in Backland and try my luck. And you can take advantage of the New Year's holiday to transfer to the technical school in Backland to prepare for the entrance exam at the Backland University of Technology and Industry in June. Just a month ago, the Backland University of Technology and Industry had been reorganized and officially upgraded to a university for industry and technology. Melissa's lips unconsciously pursed as she quietly listened. She looked around wistfully and replied softly, "Okay." Ellipsis. Friday afternoon at the Quelaag Club. Klein walked out and hired a carriage to head for Prince Adesak's Red Rose Manor. It was the place where Talim had gone to a few days before his death. As a qualified detective, he would be completely unworthy of the £100 he was paid, if he didn't hold any investigations there. No matter what, I still have to put on a convincing act. Klein muttered as he sat in the carriage and enjoyed the scenery outside the window. After his morning practice, he had roughly grasped the range of improvements in every aspect. Flame controlling, flaming jump, and other Beyonder powers had become about 30% stronger. The might of air bullets and the length of the underwater breathing pipe had even increased severalfold. His divination and combat skills had also received a substantial improvement. Paper figurine substitutes and damage transfer didn't experience much change, but because of the growth of his spirituality, the number of times that they could be used had increased. Klein finally arrived at Red Rose Manor amidst the rumbling journey and informed the two soldiers guarding the entrance of his purpose. After passing the news, he met the old butler from before. "You can ask everyone here." The white-haired elderly butler paused, then added, "Except that lady." "That's what I want. I don't want to get into trouble." Klein laughed casually. "All right." Red Rose Manor, outside the luxurious rooms filled with all kinds of antiques. Klein stood at the door and asked the sixth maid he had met today. The young maid was wearing a black and white servant dress that had the characteristics of the times. She was pretty, in her prime, and had natural curls to her brown hair. She had a hint of playfulness on her face. "Who does Mr. Talim meet when he visits?" Klein repeated the question numbly. The maid replied almost without a pause, "Mr. Talim usually requests to meet His Highness, or to accompany him in riding horses, or to discuss matters. If His Highness happens to be absent, he will meet with that lady. They are very good friends. He receives permission from the butler. Talim is good friends with the commoner lady who Prince Adesak likes. Meeting in private from time to time? It was likely that he was persuading her to leave this place, so as to not affect the reputation of the prince." Klein nodded thoughtfully. I mean, Mr. Talim and the young lady, what would they talk about? When he asked this question, Klein suddenly recalled how Talim had fallen in love just recently. With his rich experience from the information age, he somehow came up with an extremely contrived romance story. The maid wasn't afraid of the detective. She smiled, shook her head, and said, "At times like these, we're all asked to leave the room." This, even more than ever, Klein couldn't resist making associations, even to the point of changing the colors less than sup greater than 1 less than, sup greater than of Prince Adesak's hat and helmet. Without waiting for him to ask any further questions, the maid chuckled and said, "Detective Moriarty, if you want to find out exactly what the lady and Mr. Talim were talking about, you can ask her directly. The old butler doesn't permit that." Klein confidently pushed out his scapegoat. He changed the topic and said with a smile, "You seem to know more than the other servants. You even know to call me Detective Moriarty." The maid looked around, maintained her smile, and said, "It's because I've been serving the lady during my rotations. She's always wanted to meet you, Detective Moriarty. After all, she's close friends with Mr. Talim and cares a great deal about his death. Unfortunately, she always ends up missing you." "Always?" Klein was sensitive to the words, always, just happened, and missed. The maid nodded seriously and said, "The first time His Highness invited you to be his guest, she intentionally threw a tantrum and wanted to take advantage of the opportunity to walk downstairs to meet you. Who knew that you would leave in a hurry? Afterwards, she took the initiative to represent His Highness to place flowers on Mr. Talim's grave, but as she didn't know what you looked like, she wasn't able to find you. And today, she just happened to go to the golf course out back to relax on horseback. Otherwise, even if the butler didn't allow it, she would have tried to find a way to meet you. What a coincidence." Klein sighed as he suddenly grasped a crucial point. On the day of Talim's funeral, it was the commoner lady he loved who had offered flowers in the prince's place. On that day, Klein was most concerned about the lady with the black veil and the sapphire ring on her finger. She might have a Grade 0 sealed artifact or some powerful existence of an equal level. All of a sudden, a thought flashed through Klein's mind. The woman with the sapphire ring on her finger was wearing a long, heavy black dress. Accompanied by two maids, she slowly disappeared into the distance. One of the ladies had brown natural curls. The image of the maid quickly overlapped with the one in front of Klein, and it was abnormally identical. Klein's body tensed up, and sweat rolled down his back, but his expression didn't change at all. Using the abilities of a clown, he pretended like he was recalling the event, and he asked with a smile, "Were you with that lady on the day of Talam's funeral?" The maid replied without much thought, "Yes." Ellipsis. "Damn, it's really her." Klein maintained his smile. "Very well, next question." As if nothing had happened, he began to inquire about other things, then he switched to another servant and continued. However, Klein secretly shortened the process and sped up the progress. He wanted to leave Red Rose Manor before the young lady returned from her riding. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, before the sky had turned dark, Klein left the manor much earlier than expected and took the carriage sent by the old butler back to the city. Sitting in the window with his back against the wall wrapped in silk and muslin, he was relieved to have the energy to reflect on the whole situation. It was Prince Adesak's beloved commoner lady who had cursed Talam. Why did she have to deal with a descendant of a fallen noble family? To take revenge against Talam for trying to break up the relationship between her and the prince? But there's no need for her to do it herself. She can find a chance to mention it while in bed. Prince Adesak has plenty of ways to make Talam disappear without a sound. Talam was in a state of deep love before he died. Yes, the first sign was after he successfully persuaded the commoner lady to leave Prince Adesak. They had an affair? So, the commoner lady who was brought back to the manor killed Talam in order to silence him and remove any latent dangers. Logically speaking, it makes sense, but the problem is how could a person with a Grade 0 sealed artifact or a powerhouse of an equivalent level be restricted by Prince Adesak? Even if the Augustus family is an angel family, with the accumulation of enough knowledge, they would still need to use tremendous strength and special methods to be able to restrain someone like that. This isn't something a prince can do. Besides, how could such a figure have taken a fancy to Talam? Why does she want to see me all the time? Did she sense that I'm using the grey fog to spy on her? No, if that were the case, I would have been buried with Talam on the day of his funeral. Besides, when she first wanted to see me, I didn't have any blood, hair, or belongings. I hadn't made any divinations yet. Klein was puzzled as he thought about it. In the end, he decided to bury the problem deep within his heart. He wasn't to probe or investigate. I hope that the machinery hivemind, with my earlier reminder, will pay importance to this matter of noticing the royal family's abnormality. Yes, they might regard it with great importance, not because of Prince Adesak's reputation, but for another reason. I hope the royal family continues to prevent the lady from visiting me. After a few days, when the time is right, I'll relinquish this mission, express how powerless I am on this matter, and then use the excuse of going to the south for a holiday, to change my identity and hide for a while. Klein's heart gradually calmed down. Evenings in Backland were always replaced by dark clouds and drizzling rain, and Klein, who felt physically and mentally exhausted, held down his half-top hat and walked quickly across the wet street to number 15 Minsk Street under the illumination of the street lamps. After resting for a bit and taking advantage of the dark surroundings, he took 4 steps counterclockwise and went above the grey fog. After advancing to sequence 6 Faceless, he had always wanted to check the mysterious space to see if there were any changes. However, as he was too tired last night and couldn't wake up in the middle of the night, he had to wait until he was done being busy outside. In addition, Klein had to eliminate any interference in order to divine a particular matter. That was, after this advancement, when his spirituality wasn't stable yet, he didn't hear the illusory ravings of Hornassus. Phlegria, Hornassus, Phlegria, Hornassus, Phlegria, anymore. He wanted to know if this was a natural change after ascending to sequence 6, or if there was some other reason. Within the majestic palace, the mottled bronze tables and the 22 high-back chairs with different symbols on their backs stood quietly, as if they had remained unchanged since time immemorial. The same was true for the grey fog below them, as well as the endless emptiness around them. But as soon as Klein entered, his spiritual intuition was keenly aware that the mysterious space was somewhat different from before. He was in no hurry to explore or make any attempts. Calming himself down, he sat at the end of the table, conjured a pen and paper, and wrote a divination statement. The reason why I haven't heard any ravings after my advancement. Holding the piece of paper and muttering the sentence, Klein leaned back in his chair and quickly entered the dreamland with the help of cogitation. In the dusky sky and land, images flashed, and in the end, they all came to a stop on a particular scene. It was Klein, whose face and body was still covered in pale granules. He was surrounded by an illusory, thin layer of gray fog that was undetectable. The dream shattered. Klein opened his eyes and roughly understood the reason. The gray fog has interwoven with reality, helping me block out the ravings that come from who knows where. After advancing to sequence 6, my connection with the mysterious space above the gray fog has become even stronger, thus, bringing about certain changes and allowing me to naturally borrow a portion of its powers? From the looks of it, that should be the case. Yes, I should try to explore the area and see if there are any changes. Klein slowly stood up and followed his spiritual perception, walking in a certain direction outside the ancient palace. Beneath his feet was the gray fog that spread out like the sea. He finally decided to stop after walking for an unknown period of time. However, when he gave up on exploring, a light suddenly flickered at the end of the path. In his joy, Klein quickened his pace and approached. 7 or 8 seconds later, he saw a flight of stairs that seemed to lead to heaven. The staircase was formed from pure light. It was holy, transparent, and untainted, capable of shocking anyone's heart. There were only 4 levels as the staircase reached up into the void, and each level was rather high, as though it was meant for creatures even larger than giants. Klein looked up, followed its path, and saw a layer of grayish-white fog, condensed and suspended in midair, as though it was supporting something. It was a significant distance from the staircase of light. The 4-step staircase represents my consumption of the sequence 9, sequence 8, sequence 7, and sequence 6 potions. What exactly is above that layer of fog? Klein cautiously advanced until he reached the staircase of light and stepped onto it. There was nothing odd about the steps, and they were as solid as stone. Klein went up the stairs, climbed up to the 4th level, and then tried to look up at the area above the gray fog. Unfortunately, his vision couldn't penetrate anything. He thought for a moment, then he took 2 steps forward and jumped up with all his might. However, the moment he left the staircase of light, he lost his momentum and his spirit body's flight instinct. He plummeted straight down and landed on the bottom layer of the gray fog. Looks like I need to advance another 2 to 3 other sequences. If sequence 4 really does result in a qualitative change, then I should be able to see after becoming a demigod. Klein looked up and made a judgment. After looking around, Klein, who had found nothing else, returned to the stone pillar-propped ancient palace. He sat at the head of the long bronze table with his eyes half closed. He examined his spirituality growth with the number of members he could draw in. Including the empty positions that I could handle from before, I can still recruit 4 new members. However, there are no suitable targets at the moment. Klein shook his head and muttered before returning to the real world to busy himself for a good dinner. After slicing potatoes, boiling beef, adding onions, and stir-frying them for a while, as well as sprinkling seasonings like sugar and pepper, Klein poured the prepared hot water into the saucepan, covered it with a lid, and turned the fire down. I have to admit that a magician's flame controlling is a good helper in the kitchen. Ever since I got it, my culinary skills have clearly improved. If it wasn't for the loss of control, the monsters, the searches, and the evil gods, the world would be at peace and perfect if everyone was dedicated to using their abilities without causing public damage. Klein sighed and left the kitchen to enter the living room. As the light from the wall lamp spilled out, Klein, who had been planning on flipping through magazines and wait for the appropriate time to throw in the potatoes, carrots, and the proper amount of salt, he couldn't help thinking about how to act as a faceless. Just after waking up this morning, my spirituality had completely stabilized. I discovered that although there aren't any signs of digesting the faceless potion in me, I do have a certain level of harmony. This is a phenomenon that never happened after consuming the seer, clown, and magician potions. With this in mind, Klein looked up at the oriel window. As it was already dark outside, it had become like a mirror, faithfully reflecting Sherlock Moriarty with his black hair, brown eyes, beard, and gold-rimmed glasses. Klein nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps it's because I've always been acting as Klein Moretti. Yes. In a way, Sherlock Moriarty is just Klein's disguise, not someone else. Although I've received many memory fragments and gained some of the original's feelings that previously existed, in essence, I'm still a guest from an alternate world. I am Earth's keyboard warrior, Joe Mingrui. I've been through so much in the last 5 months that sometimes I even think I'm Klein Moretti. Amidst the silence, many thoughts flashed through Klein's mind, giving him a lot of insight. However, I'm still Joe Mingrui, who's donning the skin of Klein Moretti. Someone who has never given up the idea of returning. He slowly closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the figure reflected on the oriel window had already changed. It was a young man with dark brown eyes and short black hair. His facial features were unremarkable, and he appeared refined, but he had obvious eyebags with an inkling of a double chin. This was Joe Mingrui from Earth. Long time no see. Klein sighed, raised his hands and rubbed his face. By the time he lowered his arms, he was back as Sherlock Moriarty. After this period of contemplation and adjustment, he inexplicably felt that the gap between his spirituality and the potion had reduced significantly, and there were signs of them slowly blending together. No wonder Nimblewright Master Rosago's teacher. Yes, perhaps his teacher would say that you can disguise yourself as anyone, but you are ultimately yourself. This is likely a core rule of a faceless's acting method. Once one forgets this point, it would be easy to forget yourself amidst the constant changes, eventually turning into a monster. Klein felt enlightened when he recalled what he had previously obtained via spirit channeling. He crossed his right leg and leaned back, quickly coming up with a plan for the future. Search for and conclude the actual acting rules for a faceless. In the Beyonder circles of Backland, through the Tarot Club, gather information about mermaids, in preparation to complete the ritual at sea. Directly or indirectly get the Solar High Priest potion formula to help Little Sun advance to Sequence 7, so that he has the clearance to obtain the method for removing a rampager's mental corruption on a Beyonder characteristic. But I can't fully place my hopes on Little Sun. I should still attempt to look. Klein, whose mood was slowly turning staid, snapped his fingers, reducing the stove's fire in the kitchen as the fragrance of beef emanated. At that moment, he heard the doorbell ring. The visitor was none other than Lawyer Jurgen. Even though it was drizzling and the ground was wet, Jurgen was still dressed meticulously. He even wore a vertical collar. What's the matter? Klein, who was very familiar with Jurgen, didn't make any small talk and directly asked. Jurgen put away his black umbrella, patted a few drops of water off of his double-breasted frock coat and said, Sherlock, I'm leaving Backland on Monday next week to go south on a holiday with my grandmother. The warm environment and the clean air suits her very well. That's excellent news. Klein took the initiative to deduce, smiling as he asked, Do you want me to temporarily adopt Brody? Jurgen shook his head gravely. My grandma can't bear to part with Brody and insisted on taking him with her. I've already asked. As long as we put him in a cage and buy a full-price ticket, he can board the steam locomotive, but we have to keep the cage clean at all times to not pollute the air above. Honestly, the smell in the third-class carriage is enough to overwhelm the stench of cat poop. Klein chuckled. Brody shouldn't be too happy to leave, right? But he's even more reluctant to part with my grandmother, Jurgen replied. He pressed his hat and changed the subject. I'm here to inform you that if you need to be released on bail or settle any legal disputes during this period of time, you can go to my colleague. Here is his business card. I've already informed him that he wouldn't be leaving Backland this year. What a professional, to think that he even considered this problem. However, I don't need to do that for now. I'm now an informant for the machinery hivemind, and I won't be remanded at the police station under normal circumstances. Klein thanked him with a smile, took the name card, and slipped it into his pocket. Jurgen didn't have any intention of chatting or entering the room. He immediately raised his hand and said, I still have to visit the rest of my clients. Sherlock, I'll see you tomorrow. No, I'll see you next year. Then, I must wish your family a happy new year in advance. Klein smiled and waved. After watching Jurgen leave with his umbrella, Klein closed the door and sat back down in the living room. At this moment, apart from the flame which was licking the bottom of the pot in the kitchen, there were no other sounds coming from the house. It was so quiet that Klein could hear the carriages outside moving in the distance. He looked around slowly and saw the coffee table, contracts, cupboards, pens, porcelain cups, dining table, chairs, and walls. Retracting his gaze, Klein leaned back against the sofa and looked out the window at the dark night and the street lamps emitting a misty glow in the dark. In the deep cold silence, he sighed. The new year, the lightning gradually calmed down, and the darkness became the ruler of the earth. The exploratory team from the City of Silver finally reached their destination after a short but, at the same time, not short trek and numerous battles. On both sides of the street, most of the houses had collapsed. Only a few could barely hold on, but their surfaces were mottled with the dust of time. With the help of an animal hide lantern whose light didn't reach far, Derek Berg saw the completely collapsed walls and streets that were in such ruin that even weeds didn't grow. On both sides of the streets were half-collapsed houses, with a tiny minority barely standing. However, their surfaces were mottled and filled with signs of aging. The white and blue colors that formed the foundation of the coatings, the pointed structures which were different from the City of Silver, had already turned gray, making it hard for anyone to imagine their original appearance. However, Derek could figure out the city's past through such observations. It had definitely experienced a long history with a considerable number of inhabitants, developing its own civilization in the Dark Ages. The humans here took potions, built and repaired buildings, and defended the city wall. About 6 teams or more had explored the outside and hunted monsters in search of the necessary resources to survive. They would celebrate for any brief periods of calm, offering sacrifices to the gods and yearning for a response. They gave birth to the next generation, allowing hope to continue. However, in the end, they disappeared into the darkness, losing all their voices and leaving behind only ruins. The ruins were like a huge grave, burying a civilization that had struggled to survive but eventually vanishing dismally. Demon Hunter Colin looked around, his expression somewhat solemn, as though he saw the future of the City of Silver. He pointed ahead and said, "The other places have already been cleared. The temple is in the center of the city." The exploratory team dispersed a bit, but they still maintained sufficient order and didn't let down their guard. After passing through ruins that had been destroyed for an unknown period of time and went past streets so quiet that they drove people mad, Derek finally saw a high, wide artificially made platform. On top of the high platform, there was a half-collapsed building. It looked extremely similar to the temples in the City of Silver. It had a dome propped up by pillars, creating an arched entrance. The style of the buildings here was completely different from that of the other buildings. It really is true that they later converted to the fallen creator. The thought had barely crossed Derek's mind when the 4 lanterns in the team went out at the same time. All of a sudden, the exploratory team was plunged into pure darkness. There was no lightning in the sky, the candles on the ground had extinguished, and all human breathing seemed to disappear at once. Derek's body immediately tensed, as he felt as if some monster had stuck its tongue out in the darkness and was trying to lick his scalp, but his spiritual perception told him that nothing real had appeared. At that moment, an immature, helpless, terrified, and dry voice sounded out by his ear. It was a child whispering, "Save me! Save me!" For a moment Derek froze, not knowing how to react, but in an instant, a coruscating glimmer of dust appeared before him. The dust exploded one after another, igniting a silvery white light that illuminated the surrounding area. Colin stared at Derek and said in a deep voice, "What's on your mind?" Derek instantly snapped to his senses and clasped his hands in shame and pressed them to his mouth and nose as if in prayer. His body immediately emitted rays of clean, pure light, causing the surrounding darkness to silently disperse. The other team members seized the moment to reignite the candles. Because of the Demon Hunter's timely reaction, no members disappeared this time, nor were there any new members appearing. Colin retracted his gaze from Derek and looked at the half-collapsed temple on the high platform. He solemnly said, "From now on, we can't afford to be careless. We have to be on full alert." Within the half-collapsed temple, only a few stone pillars remained intact as they collectively supported half of the main hall. At the very front of the main hall, there was an altar covered in cracks. In the middle of the altar, there was a huge, pitch-black cross. Hanging from the cross was a naked man who was hanging upside down. Around his ankles, thighs, and torso there were obvious rusty metal spikes protruding outward that were accompanied by bright red bloodstains. Derek knew that this was the statue of the fallen creator, but he couldn't help look down to size up the statue's face. He saw the face of the statue, the nose, mouth, and ears were all blurry, except for the eyes which were carved with abnormal clarity. The fallen creator's eyes were tightly shut, as though he was suffering from guilt and pain. "Look away, don't study the statue of an evil god," Demon Hunter Colin warned in a low voice. "Yes, Your Excellency." The few members of the exploratory team immediately retracted their gazes. Before today, although the City of Silver had discovered many destroyed cities and written records pointing to evil gods during their explorations, most of the residents had never seen the statues of so-called evil gods. The remaining area of the temple wasn't very wide, so the exploratory team quickly split up into groups of 2 or 3 and completed the investigations without finding anything abnormal. Upon seeing this, Colin, the chief of the 6-member council, said after a few seconds of deliberation, "Let's head underground." As he spoke, he drew one of the two swords he carried on his back and smeared it with a grayish-silver ointment. Then, he removed a small metal bottle from a hidden compartment on his belt, pulled out the stopper, and gulped the contents of the potion. At this moment, Derek felt as if the light blue eyes of the chief had become a little brighter. The members of the exploratory team made their utmost careful preparations. Under the illumination of the 4 animal hide lanterns, they followed the stairs on the left side of the statue as they walked down into the underground area. Derek took his turn holding the lantern, walking at the front left as he cautiously entered the darkness. He heard the sound of his own footsteps and those of his companions echoing off of the stone steps. They produced a distant and empty echo. The echoes didn't suffer from any interference, making the absolute silence beneath them obvious. However, in the hearts of the exploratory team members, it was like a knock on the door. The attempt to uncover a secret that had been buried for an unknown number of years left them feeling extremely tense. After walking without having any sense of time, Derek finally saw that the road ahead had turned flat. He also saw the newly discovered mural which the corrupted Dark Regents had mentioned. The mural was spread across 2 sides of the wall. It was simply colored and gloomy, looking ancient as if it had seen the vicissitudes of life. Derek took a casual glance and was immediately attracted by one of the murals. On the wall to the left up ahead, a pure white cross was depicted in the middle. It was surrounded by seawater-like blackness, drowning all the humans who were struggling as they stretched out their arms. Hanging upside down from the cross was the fallen creator. The rusted nails and blood-red stains were no different from the statues in the outside world. But in this mural, the fallen creator was suffering from a black erosion, so much so that part of the white of the cross had become pitch black. In addition, the cross supported a hazy piece of land, and countless humans were kneeling and praying to the fallen creator. Around the mural, in the deepest part of the darkness, there were 6 figures akin to evil gods. In the upper left corner was a woman wearing a black, classical dress. Her clothes were layered but not complicated, and it was embedded with a starry sheen. Her body was relatively ethereal, with signs of rippling outward. Her face was blurry, as though she was wearing a mask without any facial features. The darkness around her surged as one strange eye after another faintly became discernible. Directly above was a young man wearing a pure white robe. His face was painted with a pure gold color, and there were tentacles in the form of light growing out of his skin. In his hands was a putrid green book and a radiant spear, and his chest and back were inverted. In the upper right corner was a trident-wielding monster with an octopus-like head, wide eyes, and a body wrapped in lightning. The feathers of countless birds formed his cloak, and the darkness turned into waves that supported the bottom of his feet. At the bottom right was a supple and beautiful woman. Her chest bulged, propping her clothes up. In her arms was a rotting baby, and at her feet were black ears of wheat, spring water squirming with flesh, herbs dripping with pus, and wildly mating animals. Directly below was an old man wearing a hood that revealed his mouth, wrinkles, and a white beard. The old man held an open book, and on top of it was an eye that was the symbol of omniscience. At first glance, this old man looked the most normal, but the smile on his face was indescribably evil. At the bottom left was a giant warrior in tattered armor. He held a long sword and was sitting on a throne with bleak dusk as its backdrop. What this mural means is that when the cataclysm struck, the evil gods climbed out of the abyss. In order to save the people of the world, the fallen creator had suffered the vast majority of the sins and pain, and as a result, showed signs of being corrupted and having his image changed. But, I think, he is the worst evil god. Carrying an animal hide lantern in his hand, Derek looked at the mural on the wall as he walked. He realized that the description was identical to Dark Regents's description, with the core theme being that the place where they were had not been abandoned by the gods. Instead, it was blessed by the Creator and had maintained civilization through the apocalypse. Of course, Dark Regents had only briefly mentioned it, and the details were far what the murals depicted. Throughout the entire process, Derek didn't let his guard down. He prepared himself in case any accidents were to happen so that he could respond immediately. Under the dim yellow light of the candle, the exploratory team went through many corridors, halls, and rooms one by one, delving deep into the temple's basement. Suddenly, a semi-open gray stone door appeared in front of them. Outside the door, a cluster of beautiful mushroom-shaped objects grew. They were palm-sized, with white stems and bright red heads, sparkling with dark golden specks. Upon seeing these mushrooms, the members of the exploratory team had their appetites whet. All they wanted to do was to rush over, pull out a stalk, and stuff it into their mouths. Gulp. Quite a few people swallowed their saliva. However, most of the people who were able to enter the exploratory team had rich experience and were of a relatively high sequence. Having received a warning beforehand, someone immediately stood up and said in a low voice, "Those are rotten flesh and hairy scalps." Derek knew this teammate and that his name was Joshua. He had successfully traded for a mystical item from a particular exploratory expedition. Joshua stretched out his left, scarlet-gloved hand at the door. With a flash of light, a burning fireball quickly took shape and shot out, landing directly on those extremely tempting mushrooms. Boom! The ground trembled slightly, and an inferno spread out to cover the space of 2 meters. By the time the fire subsided, all of the mushrooms had already disappeared, leaving only bits and pieces of flesh and blood. It left all of the Beyonders, who nearly failed to resist the temptation, disgusted. Demon Hunter Colin didn't interfere with the actions of the team. He quietly watched from the side, nodding from time to time. Why would there be mushrooms made from flesh and hair? Where did the flesh and hair come from? Joshua withdrew his left palm and muttered to himself in confusion. Another member of the team made a bold guess. The original inhabitants of this city? It's possible. Perhaps their deaths were a result of turning into pure flesh and hair. Derek agreed inwardly. After a brief discussion, the exploratory team split into several groups and cleaned up the hall outside the grey stone door. After doing all this, they regrouped and slowly passed through the door, ready to engage in combat at any moment. Behind the door was a place that looked like an altar. The surrounding light could hardly dispel the darkness of the region, which seemed to hide something unknown. Above the altar, a similar pitch-black cross and an upside-down fallen creator was erected there. Carrying an animal hide lantern, Derek stood the closest as he instinctively swept a glance. His gaze suddenly froze because he discovered that the fallen creator statue here was different from the one outside. Its eyes were open. He had blood-red eyes and black pupils, staring straight at any intruders like it possessed life. Tat! 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 Derek heard the chattering of teeth. He originally imagined that it came from a team member, but he soon realized that he was the one trembling. Although he didn't understand much about the evil god's dangers, his teeth were instinctively chattering at that instant. Tat! 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 His teammates reacted similarly. At that moment, a speck of powder floated into the air. Demon Hunter Colin clenched his fist. Boom! As the sound of thunder reverberated through the air, Derek and the others suddenly snapped to their senses, escaping their nightmare state from earlier. Before they could investigate the area, the sound of weeping could be heard from behind the altar. Sob, sob, sob. Sob, sob, sob. In the chilling silence, Demon Hunter Colin calmly ordered, "Derek, Joshua, go around and take a look." As a chill went through his body, Derek held the animal hide lantern and the axe of Hurricane in his hand. Together with Joshua, he slowly walked around to the back of the altar. As the darkness was gradually dispersed by the light, they saw a black figure curled up behind the altar. After taking 2 steps forward, the shadow revealed its original form. It was a 7- or 8-year-old child, with soft yellow hair. He closed his eyes, as though he wasn't used to the light as he shouted in excitement, "Save me, save me." Derek's pupils shrank, and when he thought of the cry for help he had heard in the pure darkness earlier, he subconsciously lifted his axe of Hurricane. At this moment, Demon Hunter Colin took a step forward and solemnly asked, "Who are you?" The child stopped pleading for help and said reminiscently, My name is Jack." After dinner, Klein put on his coat and hat in preparation to head out. He was going to find Miss Sharon, resolve the problem of the Baronet digging up a tunnel, and ask for clues about mermaids. He wanted to complete these matters before Detective Sherlock Moriarty headed south for a vacation. Outside the Bravehearts bar, a rental carriage briskly drove by. Inside the carriage, Klein, who was wearing a half-top hat, was sitting opposite Sharon, who was still wearing her black Gothic regal dress. Looking at the expressionless and pale face of his former bodyguard, Klein was at a loss on how to exchange pleasantries. He could only go straight to the point. "I'm done with my preparations." Although Sequence 6 Faceless had only given him 1 Beyonder ability, all the powers he had before had experienced a clear upgrade, resulting in a great improvement to his strength. This was the best form of preparation. However, a Faceless's powers could be deemed a godly skill in certain situations. For example, when being pursued or trying to infiltrate, Klein couldn't help but let his imagination run wild. Sharon listened quietly and simply said, "Tonight?" She spoke with a slight rise in intonation towards the end to indicate an inquiry. If it's fine with you, then I'm fine as well, Klein responded, prepared. All right, Sharon nodded. After a few seconds of silence, Klein asked in deliberation, have you heard about anything to do with mermaids? Do you know where one can meet such a creature of legends? Sharon's blue eyes stared unblinkingly at Klein, as though she had transformed into a real doll. After a while, she emotionlessly said, there are no longer mermaids in places where humans can reach. Only the fishermen of the Gargas Islands would occasionally hear the mermaids singing in the midst of a storm during their long voyages to hunt white-tailed whales. Located in the depths of the Sonia Sea, the Gargas Islands was the farthest human colony in the sea, characterized by local products such as whale oil and whale meat. I wonder if this rumor is true or fake. Klein nodded. I understand. Ellipsis. The bell chimes in the night rang out quietly, as though they came from a faraway place. There was an abandoned chapel in the middle of William Street. Withered vines crawled over its walls and grey stones were strewn everywhere. Inside the chapel, feces and debris intertwined amidst the rocks and dead grass. In the half-collapsed corner, a middle-aged man, wearing black tights, was moving stones that hid the entrance to a cave. He carefully and excitedly went into the tunnel, carrying his digging tools, lighting tools, and earth basket. His hair was grey at the temples, and his eyes were puffy. He was Baronet Rafter Pound, who was considered mentally ill by the outside world, but he was secretly a descendant of the Tudor family of the Fourth Epoch. This prodigy, who was always entangled with high-class callgirls, had a serious expression on his face, and his eyes were bright. It was impossible to find any signs of him being addicted to drinking and sex. He pushed himself up on his elbows and rapidly crawled down the slope, as though the end of the tunnel hid the greatest and only hope of his life. Not long after, he touched the wet mud and cold stone in front of him. This didn't extinguish Rafter Pound's enthusiasm. He repeated motions that he was extremely proficient with after having recently gained the experience. As he was digging, carrying, and moving things, an empty area appeared before him. It was a dark underground palace that was in front of him. Rafter Pound's expression immediately became crazed with excitement. He quickly moved forward and grabbed the black iron badge. The badge was a hand holding a scepter. Seeing this, Rafter Pound's eyes lit up as if they were on fire. Just as he put the black iron badge on his chest, everything in front of him shattered. He was still in the narrow and irregular tunnel, with wet mud and ice-cold stones in front of him. No, there was someone else there who was quietly watching him. He had no eyes, no nose, no mouth, no eyebrows, and no ears. Rafter Pound's pupils contracted. He could only feel a numbness rising along his spine from his waist down to the back of his head. Without even thinking about it, he immediately threw away all his tools and frantically retreated. His elbows smacked the ground, but he felt no pain despite having a mangled wound. Finally, Rafter Pound left the tunnel and returned to the abandoned chapel. Because of the loss of his lantern, he could only see the deep darkness and the dim crimson that shrouded the edges. Suddenly, the withered vines that were crawling up the wall swayed like snakes. A figure walked out from the darkness. She was wearing a Gothic regal dress and a black small soft hat, with a pale face to the point of being transparent, as well as pale blonde hair and blue eyes that didn't look human. Rafter Pound almost shouted out loud. For such a woman to appear in an environment such as this was no different from a ghost story from folklore. Tap, tap, tap. He took a few steps back and almost tripped over a rock. At that moment, he seemed to think of something, and he suppressed his horror in an instant, revealing an excited and hopeful expression. Hey, are you that evil spirit inside the underground palace? Yes, it must be you. Sir Pound, there seems to be a misunderstanding. Faceless Klein came out of the tunnel and stood in the shadows. His and Sharon's original plan had been to scare Rafter Pound off, scaring him so badly that he would no longer dare to explore the underground ruins again. However, Rafter Pound's reaction was somewhat out of their expectations. Sharon was silent for a second before tacitly asking, "What do you wish to say?" Rafter Pound quietly exhaled, and he then curled his lips into a smile. After attempting for so many years, I believe you already understand that killing the descendants of the Tudor family won't help you break the seal. Only by working with me, who has the great Tudor bloodline, can you hope to get out of this predicament that has lasted for more than 2,000 years. The Tudors knew about the existence of the evil spirit, but they still died in that room. Klein frowned as spoke before Sharon could. He imitated Sharon's ethereal voice. What took you until today to come here? This was a branch of the Faceless's Beyonder powers, to mimic the sound of a target. He could reproduce any voice as long as he heard it before. Of course, Klein believed he couldn't repeat the ravings of the true creator and the pleas of Mr. Door. This Beyonder power was still limited to the realm of ordinary people. Sharon looked sideways at him but didn't expose him. Rafter Pound didn't notice and chuckled. It's because the Dark Emperor has appeared. Fate tells me that the glory of the Blood Emperor will appear once again. Is there some logical connection? Klein had an inexplicable feeling that Rafter Pound was more like a madman than before. He asked in Sharon's voice again, Dark Emperor? Ha ha. Rafter Pound laughed. Yes, Hero Bandit Dark Emperor. He must be closely related to the real Dark Emperor. Why don't I know that? Klein felt amused. He thought for a moment, then he stopped asking, giving up the right to ask questions. Sharon, for some reason, remained silent. Upon seeing this, Rafter Pound was overjoyed as he quickly asked, So, what's your answer? I refuse, Sharon replied emotionlessly. Rafter suppressed his anxiety and tried to persuade her again. At this moment, his eyes suddenly glazed over as he abruptly took a few steps to the side, arriving at a relatively intact stone wall. This, Klein and Sharon noticed an abnormality at the same time. They responded in their own ways, one pulling out a revolver and pointing it at Rafter Pound, the other filling the ruined chapel with a crimson lunar brilliance. Rafter Pound didn't even look at them. He faced the stone wall and slammed his head into it. Thump, thump, thump. He slammed his head 3 times in a row and fainted with blood dripping from his forehead. Then he got up again, his eyes were bloodshot for some unknown reason. Rafter Pound raised his right hand and wiped the blood from his forehead, covering his palm with blood. He stuck out the tip of his tongue, licked the scarlet liquid, and said in an intoxicated manner, A member of the Tudor bloodline sure is delicious. It's really intoxicating. It will allow my loathing to exceed its limits to the greatest extent, and it will help me temporarily expand the boundary of the seal. Klein's muzzle was aimed at him as he asked in a stunned tone, The evil spirit in the ruins? Blood trickled across Rafter Pound's face, and he laughed horribly. You guessed right. Before, I judged that you were weak and wanted to corrupt your mind and enter your dreams to tempt you into rescuing me. Who knows, heh, you're also a person with a secret. Don't be so direct. Klein subconsciously glanced at Sharon, but he found nothing out of the ordinary about her. What do you want to do? Klein asked directly. The evil spirit sighed. I'm an innocent person who was harmed because of Alista Tudor's ambition. Due to the constraints of my corpse, I've been trapped in that underground ruin for nearly 2,000 years. I hope that you can help me out of this predicament and allow me to become a free spirit. I swear, I won't involve innocent people. After saying that, he looked at Sharon with his bloodshot eyes. You should be a wraith from the mutant pathway. The next stop is a critical point to becoming a demigod. I'm not sure if you have the puppet potion formula, but I can help you obtain it. I can even be a part of your ritual. That is the reward I can promise you. Puppet, Sequence 4 of the mutant pathway is called Puppet? What a strange name. Klein muttered inwardly. The evil spirit turned to look at him. You will similarly be rewarded. It's an object that can be considered mystical and precious, and because of some sort of attraction, its holder came to the underground palace and died by the side of the Tudor descendants. This is what it looks like. As he spoke, the evil spirit spread open the palm of his hand, causing the crimson moonlight to form a scene. Inside the picture, there was a normal-looking tarot card. The image on it was completely different from the others. Sitting inside a chariot wasn't a king, but rather a male priest wearing a dark red robe. The priest looked like Russell Gustav. This, a card of blasphemy. Klein's eyes instantly shifted. He saw that the starlight in the upper left corner had condensed into a line of text. Sequence 0, Red Priest. Sequence 0, Red Priest. Which pathway's Sequence 0 is this? I've learned the true name of another Sequence 0. Of course, the pretext is that the evil spirit isn't lying. It said that the holder of the Red Priest card would seek out the underground ruins of the Tudor family due to some form of attraction, but they ended up dying in that room. This should be the law of convergence of Beyonder characteristics within the same pathway, right? No, Emperor Russell had apparently mentioned that after advancing to become a high-sequence Beyonder, possessing a corresponding card of blasphemy would allow them to subtly sense the Beyonder ingredients needed for subsequent sequences. In other words, the room where the evil spirit is sealed has a demigod-ranked characteristic of the Red Priest, path of the divine hidden within. Perhaps, the evil spirit was a demigod of this pathway when it was still alive, and it might even be a little stronger. The subtle sensation provided by the card of blasphemy is probably a result of the law of convergence. Klein suddenly thought of many things. He subconsciously turned his head to look at Sharon to see her reaction. By doing so, he could determine if she knew about the card of blasphemy and whether she understood the meaning of a sequence 0. However, there was no change in Sharon's nearly transparent face. It was as if the evil spirit had just shown an ordinary tarot card. However, this actually implies something. When any Beyonder first come to learn of a sequence 0, they will subconsciously think about what it represented. Perhaps only a Beyonder in the spectator pathway can read the subtle body language of Miss Sharon. Klein sighed to himself. Seeing that both of them were silent at the same time, the evil spirit gave Klein a deep glance, slowly making the projection of the card of blasphemy disappear. It once again looked at Sharon with its bloodshot eyes and said with a low and hoarse laugh, "If you are unwilling to become a demigod of the mutant pathway, then I can provide you with the sequence 4 potion formula of the abyss pathway. The temperance of desire and the flamboyance of malice has always been very congruous, isn't it?" Sharon ignored the evil spirit's question and turned unhurriedly to Klein, leaving him to respond. What the evil spirit means is that the mutant pathway and the abyss pathway are closely related pathways which are exchangeable at high sequences. How the Rose School of Thought and the Blood Sanctify sect act on the surface does seem very similar. Klein thought for 2 seconds and looked at the bloodied rafter pound. Then, how can your seal be removed? The evil spirit laughed and said, "Very simple. Find a direct descendant of the Sauron, Einhorn, and Medici family and obtain 10 milliliters of their blood, each. A little more is fine, but not less. Then mix them with holy water and pour them into my room. This way, the seal will be lifted. It's a very simple and strange method. Even in the field of mysticism, it's rare. Why must they be direct descendants of the Sauron, Einhorn, and Medici families? I have never heard of the last one. Sauron is the former royal family of Intis, and Einhorn is the royal family of the Faesak Empire. Both of them were loyal to the Trunsost Empire, the angel family of the Fourth Epoch, and they were the final winners. However, Loans Augustus and Phaenopotter's Castia families also meet the same conditions. Oh right, the Sauron and Einhorn family have one more thing in common, and that is their possession of the Hunter pathway. Is this the reason for them being chosen? Taking the situation from before into context, the Hunter pathway is equal to the Red Priest pathway? As he made a guess, Klein didn't conceal his doubts. I know about the Sauron and Einhorn families, but I've never heard of the Medici family. Very normal. They often enjoy hiding in the shadows. They are corrupted angels and have established an extremely secretive organization, the evil spirit said with a contemptuous tone. That organization is known as Rose Redemption. This name is very familiar. That's right, inside the abandoned temple of the true creator that was recently found by the City of Silver, there is something similar written on a corner of a mural. They suspect that it's the name of the city or the creator of the temple. Now, from the looks of it, this symbolizes an extremely secretive organization that was founded by corrupted angels. They believe in the true creator? What is their relationship with the Aurora Order? Klein pondered for a moment and said, "It's related to the true creator?" The evil spirit was silent for 2 seconds before asking in a low voice, "You know about Rose Redemption?" "I heard it by chance." Klein spoke the absolute truth. The evil spirit thought for a moment, then it suddenly said with a smile, "You have more secrets than I thought. Can we not talk about such things?" Klein held himself back from watching Sharon's response as he wore an unperturbed look. The evil spirit's gaze swept across the two and laughed. "Rose Redemption has a close relationship with the birth of the true creator. It's impossible for you to imagine that certain people were once members of Rose Redemption, but they have since left it. As long as you find an organization that believes in the true creator and trace it to the very end, then there will be a chance of you coming into contact with Rose Redemption. It sounds a little like the Twilight Hermit Order, with one being the front side while the other the backside." Klein made an intuitive guess. Seeing that the evil spirit had no intention of giving an in-depth introduction to Rose Redemption, he laughed and said, "Do you think we can complete something like that with our strengths?" The evil spirit was silent for a few seconds before saying, "Maybe you guys can try your luck in Binshi Town." "Binshi Town? Where's that?" Despite Klein's repeated questioning, the evil spirit refused to reveal anything else. Faced with this situation, Klein could only switch to asking, during the Fourth Epoch, were the Dark Emperor, Blood Emperor, and Night Emperor fighting for the position of Sequence 0? When the evil spirit heard this, it was stunned for a moment before it smiled and said, "It was the case, but not later. It wasn't the case after Alista Tudor went mad." Alista Tudor was that Blood Emperor? Klein sought confirmation. The evil spirit nodded. Yes, there has only been one Blood Emperor, that lunatic, Alista Tudor. Heh heh. The descendants of the Tudor family have all inherited the madness of that bloodline. They're usually crafty, devious, careful, and cautious, but at critical moments, they can become reckless and not consider the repercussions. The evil spirit pointed at Rafter Pound's face and said, "He is an example. However, after this lesson, he will definitely become more normal for a long period of time. I've no idea if he's the last Tudor. Alista left quite a number of good things which require the blood of his descendants in order to gain access to them. It's best that you don't kill him now." The evil spirit paused and chuckled softly. "All right, after you help me remove the seal, I will tell you all the stories I have experienced. No, a more accurate description is the history I've experienced." Having said that, Rafter Pound's eyes suddenly lost focus. His body twitched a few times before limply collapsing to the ground. Sharon silently watched this scene before she suddenly took a step forward. Whoosh! The wind howled as the dirt and rocks on the ground began to move before falling into the underground tunnel and sealing off the entrance. After that was done, Klein and Sharon left William Street and took a detour to another block in the silent darkness. When Klein boarded the rental carriage, Sharon's figure appeared, and she sat across from him. She looked unblinkingly at Klein as she asked with her hoarse and ethereal voice, "Will you help it lift its seal?" "No." Klein didn't hesitate to reply, and then he asked, "What about you?" Sharon shook her head, indicating that she wouldn't either. Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he smiled. "It's already been dead for about 2,000 years, and right now, it's just a remnant of an evil spirit. Dispersing or returning to the spirit world is supposed to be its end. My plan is that once we become high-sequence Beyonders, we can team up and eliminate it, giving it true deliverance." Although the Red Priest card, the hidden history of the fourth epoch, and the evil spirit's promised rewards were tempting, Klein had no confidence in it at all. In his mind, he would always recall the scene of the evil spirit's corpse sitting on a high-back chair with its head lowered. He would also remember how the other party's face would be covered in traces of decay when he raised his head. Sharon tersely acknowledged, giving the necessary response. "Aren't you supposed to ask me why I'm so confident in becoming a high-sequence Beyander?" Klein couldn't help but lampoon. And the answer to that question was that people needed to have dreams. Klein no longer bothered with the topic and switched to asking, "Is the Wraith's corresponding sequence 4 really puppet?" Sharon nodded. "Do you have the potion formula or Beyander ingredients?" Klein asked in thought. Sharon shook her head. Klein let out a soft chuckle. "I'll help you keep an eye out for it in my circle." Without changing her tone, Sharon said without changing her tone, "Thank you." Klein looked out of the window and muttered to himself, "I'm going to the south for a holiday." At this point, he said with a smile, as if he were speaking to a lawyer, "Jürgen, let me wish you and Marich a happy new year in advance." Sharon was silent for 2 seconds, then she pursed her lips and replied in a fleeting voice, "Happy New Year." Her figure gradually faded and disappeared from the carriage. Looking at the little boy behind the altar and hearing his slightly hoarse and tender voice, Derek felt as if he was facing the most terrifying monster. He almost performed a downward cleave with the axe of Hurricane in his hand. From what he knew, a person who could survive in the pure darkness for so long was definitely not human. Even if he was one before, it definitely wouldn't be one after that long. Demon Hunter Colin's eyes seemed to brighten a little. He tightened his grip on his sword and asked in a calm voice, "What are you doing here?" The yellow-haired boy who called himself Jack had a pained expression as he replied, "We're looking for the holy residence of the Lord." "The holy residence of the Lord?" Colin pressed. "Right." The little boy Jack turned his head and looked at the pitch-black cross and the statue of the overturned man. "They told me that as long as I go in the direction that the Lord's eyes look in, then I will be able to reach his holy residence." "They? You still have companions?" Colin's eyes moved one full revolution as if he were a monster, taking in the surroundings. "Where are they?" Hearing this question, the little boy Jack was stunned for a moment. Suddenly, he held his throat, and with a twisted, blank look on his face, he said, "I'm so hungry. So hungry. So hungry." Amidst his trance-like words, Jack raised his head and looked at Joshua, who was wearing a pair of scarlet-red gloves. "So hungry." His mouth opened in an instant, reaching straight to his ears, revealing his neat white teeth and thick saliva that was constantly gushing out of his mouth. At the same time, he threw himself forward towards Joshua. He was so fast that he left behind an afterimage on the ground. Although Joshua was on high alert, he wasn't able to react in time. Before he could even make out what was happening, the little boy, Jack, had already pounced in front of him. Thump! The yellow-haired figure seemed to slam into an invisible wall, stopping only a step away from Joshua. Jack suspended himself in midair as a reddish glow from the darkness emerged from his body and started to corrode the transparent barrier that was denying him entry. Behind Joshua and Derek, demon hunter Colin had already fallen to one knee at some point. He had stabbed his sword, smeared with a silver ointment, into the ground. Soon after, the area around the altar instantly brightened, as if it was the purest ray of the light of dawn. Colin suddenly drew his sword, and his figure strangely split apart, turning into a series of afterimages that spread out around the altar. Every single figure raised the sword in their hands at the same time and, combined with the light of dawn in the vicinity, released a bright glow. Su! 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 One sword after another was thrust forward as the light of dawn converged towards Jack from all directions, encircling him in the middle. Under the brilliance of the rising sun, the black and red figures quickly evaporated, disappearing under the storm-like barrage of attacks. In the underground hall where the altar was located, the brilliance became abnormally bright, so bright that Derek Berg couldn't help but close his eyes. With a sudden jolt, he suddenly woke up from his slumber and saw a bonfire quietly burning in front of him and his teammates, who were diligently guarding the camp. Demon hunter Colin, who was sitting cross-legged beside a stone pillar, opened his eyes and said in a deep voice, "We will set off after 50 rounds of lightning." Upon hearing this, Derek looked up at the sky and found that the frequency of lightning hadn't significantly increased. Darkness remained the ruler of this land. When he thought of the city he was about to arrive at and the temple of the fallen creator, he couldn't help but feel slightly nervous. After spending some time calming himself down, Derek quickly ate his food and recovered his combat-ready state. "I wonder what will happen in that temple." Holding the axe of Hurricane, he came to the middle of the group. Within the campsite, lanterns that were covered with a thin layer of animal hide were being lit one after another. 15 Minsk Street. Klein heated the water, adjusted the temperature, and took a comfortable bath. With the languidness after a bath, he took 4 steps counterclockwise and went above the grey fog. He intended to use divination to make a confirmation about the evil spirit's matter. In the silence of the ancient palace, Klein leaned back in his chair and began to seriously consider which divination method to choose and how to design the divination statement. It had to conform to the principles of mysticism, it shouldn't involve subdivision or elimination, and it had to contain sufficient information. After a short period of silence, Klein leaned forward and wrote down what he wanted to confirm. The evil spirit in the ruins harbors strong malice towards Sharon and me. He undid the spirit pendulum on his left wrist, gripped it with one hand, and began entering cogitation. After muttering to himself for a while, he opened his eyes and looked forward. This time, the topaz pendant was wildly rotating clockwise. This meant that the evil spirit's malice was stronger than Klein had imagined. At that time, there was nothing abnormal about the spiritual intuition we had. That evil spirit is also a powerhouse that's good at interfering with divination and prophecy. He definitely wouldn't have imagined that one of us has the temperance to resist desire, preventing her from being blinded by greed, while the other has experienced too many things to know what it means to ask a tiger for its skin. With a sigh, Klein returned to the real world and laid down on his bed. Unfortunately, the heat brought by the sunbroach is only a psychological feeling and can't warm the bed. Before he fell asleep, he closed his eyes and thought with regret. South of the bridge, Rose Street, Harvest Church. After Emlyn White wiped the last chair, he straightened up and eagerly said to Father Utravsky, "I've finished doing today's chores." "Damn old man, don't you suddenly get ideas of getting me to copy the Holy Bible?" Emlyn prayed inwardly. The object of his prayer had unwittingly changed from the moon to Earth Mother. Father Utravsky stood there, making the vampire look like a child. He smiled and said, "Recently, you've been able to experience the joy and relaxation of working with dedication and gratitude. Go back and quietly feel the pulse of life and the pure joy that comes from it." "I haven't," Emlyn denied on reflex. Without saying anything, Father Utravsky looked at him with a kind smile, turned and took a seat, and then began his nightly prayer. Emlyn White's lips quivered as he wanted to refute, but in the end, he failed to say anything. He silently left the Harvest Church and habitually closed the door. When he returned to his current residence, he found that the house was empty. Both his parents had disappeared without a trace. It was only after witnessing this scene that he remembered that there was going to be a sanguine gathering in the Backland area tonight. "Those fellows are really disgraceful." As noble sanguine, they should sleep in coffins or stay in their own rooms. Why are they mimicking humans and holding all kinds of gatherings? There's even dancing. Emlyn muttered contemptuously. As he spoke, he touched his belly and swallowed a mouthful of saliva before deciding to change into some clothes to attend the gathering. The Odora family sure is enviable. They actually have a pure human partner who runs several hospitals and has fresh blood every day. They can drink as much as they want, anytime they want. Emlyn put on his black top hat and quickly walked out of the house. West Borough, in a brightly lit villa. Emlyn picked up a glass with scarlet liquid and hungrily took a gulp of it. It really has been pre-selected. He half closed his eyes, sighing in praise from the bottom of his heart. At this moment, on the dance floor, handsome men and beautiful women were dancing, twirling and taking slow steps with each other under the romantic music. What's the point of all of this? Emlyn stood at the edge of the railing on the second floor, looking down at his kinsman. As the largest city in the world, Backland had many vampires living in it. They hid in all walks of life and had completely integrated into human society. As for those who were unable to control their own destructive urges and bloodlust, they were either sent to castles deep in the mountains or were dealt with in advance to prevent the Nighthawks or other official Beyonder organizations from finding clues. As he looked at his fellow kinsmen, who were growing more spirited as the night went on, Emlyn increasingly felt like there was nothing in common between him and them. At that moment, the host of the banquet tonight, Cosme Odora, walked over with a wine cup in hand. Smiling, he asked, "Do you like tonight's wine?" "Of course, its owner is young enough and possesses great vitality." Emlyn straightened his back and assumed a noble posture. Based on appearances, Cosme Odora was a very gracious middle-aged gentleman, but Emlyn knew that he was over 200 years old. He had once seen Intis under the rule of Emperor Russell, and then he moved to Loen because he had lived for too long and feared that his neighbors would discover something was wrong about him. Upon hearing Emlyn's praise, he smiled and said, "Yes, its owner is a young lady who was stabbed by a thief and nearly lost her life. Fortunately, she met me, and this is the price she needs to pay for her recovery. You can have a taste of the wine over there, as well as the wine over there. The owners are from Balam and Fainapotter respectively. They have different flavors. Fainapotter? Mother Goddess, the humans there love chili so much that their blood has a spiciness that I can't stand. Mother Goddess." As he spoke, Emlyn suddenly paused, his expression instantly turning blank. The corner of Cosme's mouth twitched, and he pretended not to hear anything. In the awkward silence, he cleared his throat and said, "Emlyn, that's just your imagination. By the way, my grandfather wishes to meet you." "Your grandfather?" Emlyn was startled for a moment, but he then immediately widened his eyes. Lord Nibs? Nibs Odora was a powerful sanguine who had been active in the Fourth Epoch, but the times had corroded his life and forced him to lie in a cold coffin for extended periods of time. Cosme nodded solemnly. "Yes." With that, he turned and walked to another staircase on the second floor, not considering the possibility that Emlyn might refuse him. Emlyn followed, a little nervous and uneasy, thinking about the purpose of Lord Nibs's summons. Has he finally understood that the honor of the sanguine is more important and has decided to help me get rid of Father Utroski's psychological cue? As he walked, Emlyn White developed a strong sense of hope. Following the stairs to the underground area, Emlyn White passed through a few secret doors and entered a large grey hall. In the center of the hall was a heavy coffin made of black iron, engraved with symbols and magic labels. After Cosme Odora reported Emlyn's arrival, a heavy and aged voice slowly came out from the coffin. "Emlyn White, do you know why I summoned you? Honorable Lord Nibs, I imagine that you are planning on helping me remove the psychological cue," Emlyn responded without hesitation. Silence reigned in the underground hall for a few seconds. Then, Nibs Odora, who was lying in the coffin, chuckled and said, "That's one of the purposes, but it won't be me helping you. I just woke up from a long dream because I received a revelation from the ancestor." "Ancestor? She has awakened?" It wasn't Emlyn who exclaimed in surprise, but Cosme Odora. "After the cataclysm, doesn't the ancestor only respond to important matters?" Emlyn listened in bewilderment. "No, not yet," Nibs said in a heavy voice. "The ancestor told me that the apocalypse is near and that we must prepare for it, and you, Emlyn White, are one of the key elements in the ancestor's revelation." "Apocalypse?" Cosme asked in surprise. But Emlyn only had one thought. I, Emlyn White, was actually mentioned by the ancestor. I am a key element for the sanguine survival of the apocalypse. Nibs ignored his grandson's question and continued, "Emlyn White, I'll hand you a task right now. Please speak." Emlyn felt that he was being too modest. Even after hearing what had just been said, he didn't show any arrogance in front of Lord Nibs. Nibs Odora solemnly said, "Find a chance to pray to the fool." Ah? Emlyn suspected he had heard wrongly. Nibs lowered his voice and added, "The fool whose honorific name has only recently been spread. Although I have always had the urge to pray to the fool to get rid of the psychological cue that Father Yutravsky gave me, I also know, very clearly, that it's dangerous to recite the honorific name of an unknown being. Not all hidden existences will start with bait and slowly provide guidance. In such matters, they are often like sharks in the sea, who would go mad and lurch forward once they smell blood. But now, Lord Nibs, no, what does the ancestor want?" Emlyn White said, finding it rather ridiculous. "It will be very, very, very dangerous." Inside the black iron coffin, Nibs Odora replied with an aged voice, "Yes, under normal circumstances. But not all hidden existences are filled with malice. Among them, they will similarly abide to rules and enjoy transactions. For example, the 7 pure lights of the spirit world. Since the ancestor has given such a revelation, it means that the danger that the fool can bring is not too serious, or even none. And during this entire process, I will always be by your side to protect you. Don't you want to get rid of the psychological cue? Have you already become a believer of Earth Mother and abandoned the moon?" "No, I haven't," Emlyn frantically denied. After a moment of silence, he gritted his teeth and said, "I wish to have a few days to think it over." "All right, no problem. I believe that you will make a choice that suits your noble identity as a member of the Sanguine." Inside the coffin, Nibs's voice turned soft as he smiled and comforted him. After sending Emlyn White back to the second floor, Cosme Odora once again returned to the dark and gloomy underground hall, and he asked with confusion and doubt, "Grandfather, how could the revelation given by the ancestor involve Emlyn White? He's just a weak member of the Sanguine who only recently reached adulthood." Nibs's voice came through the thick black metal coffin lid and reverberated in the air. "No, the revelation provided by the ancestor never included Emlyn White. She only showed a scene of the dawn of the apocalypse, depicting the erosion of the crimson moon, as well as mentioning the fool and the corresponding honorific name. During this process, no Sanguine appeared. The mention of the key element was just my way of convincing Emlyn White. However, being able to take risks for the future of the Sanguine can also be considered a key element." Cosme was first enlightened before he had another question. "Why did you choose Emlyn White? What's so special about him?" Nibs Odora suddenly laughed. "Hasn't he been clamoring about praying to the fool all this time? Didn't he think that we weren't putting too much weight on his problem, that we aren't willing to antagonize Bishop Yutravsky, so he was trying to find other help? I'm just fulfilling his wish." For a long time, Cosme was speechless. Emlyn White stood at the railing of the second floor, looked down at his tireless kinsman, and nervously took a sip of his wine. "Up to this day, I haven't heard of any terrible outcome for people who prayed to the fool. Perhaps it's just as Lord Nibs said, the fool is just like the 7 pure lights in the spirit world, a hidden existence that maintains order and is warm-hearted." "Wait a minute, what are the 7 pure lights in the spirit world? Why haven't I ever heard of them before? They seem to be on the side of good? I wonder if this will be any help to me. In short, the fool isn't necessarily dangerous, and there is Lord Nibs protecting me. Maybe I can take advantage of this opportunity to get rid of the psychological cue." Emlyn consoled himself with fear and anticipation. Monday morning. Sherwood Borough, 15 Minsk Street. Klein squatted in front of the toilet, holding a brush and carefully cleaning the dirt inside it. According to his schedule, after completing his visits on Saturday and Sunday, he decided to take a day off and wait until tomorrow to report back to Prince Adesic about the final results and hand over the assignment. But during what should have been his relaxation time, he found the house a little too messy and dirty. It was only when he saw this that he remembered that the cleaning of the house had been done twice a week through the temporary employment of the landlady's maid next door. As the Sammers had gone on holiday to Seville City and Daisy Bay, one of the maids had gone along with them, while another had returned to the countryside after receiving a year-end bonus. 15 Minsk Street, where he lived, hadn't been cleaned by anyone for quite some time. Klein had planned to put up with it for 2 days since he was leaving Backland, but in his free time, he didn't dare to take the time to head to the Quelaag Club to have fun. He was afraid of infuriating Prince Adesic, so he could only stay home. Hence, seeing the things that irked him, he changed into his old clothes and began spring cleaning before the new year. He went on to scrub the toilet, wash the bathtub, wipe the windows, mop the floors, clean his equipment, and wash clothes. Klein busied himself from 8 to 11 before barely completing his desired cleanup. Of course, he only did it perfunctorily without that much attention to detail. Sometimes, renting too big a house isn't a good thing. Klein washed his hands and wiped his face with a towel. Walking out of the bathroom and looking at the clean and tidy living room and dining room, and watching the sunlight pierce through the clouds and shine through the transparent glass window, showering golden spots in his house, he had a strange sense of accomplishment. He felt a lot happier. Time to reward myself for lunch. I'll find a good restaurant. Klein returned to the second floor and changed his clothes. As he leafed through the papers, waiting for lunchtime, the doorbell rang. It's almost the new year, and there are still people coming to entrust me with missions? As he rose and walked to the door, Klein made up his mind to decline. Although he only had £34 left in cash, in order to get out of the royal strife, he had to go on vacation to the south as soon as possible. He could no longer accept assignments. To his surprise, the visitor wasn't a stranger, but the old butler of Prince Adesic. The old butler was wearing a well-cut tuxedo. He saluted without losing his dignity, and said, "Detective Moriarty, His Highness, the Prince, is waiting for you in the carriage at the end of the street. He wishes to know the progress of your investigations." So impatient? All right, that saves me the trouble of going all the way to Red Rose Manor tomorrow. Klein quickly reorganized what he had thought of last night and calmly replied, "All right." He was about to remove his hat from the coat rack when he felt a sudden ache in his stomach, a pain that required him to visit the toilet. After enduring for a while, he realized that he couldn't hold it in any longer and apologetically said to the old butler, "I'm very sorry. I'll need to use the bathroom first. My stomach isn't feeling well." The old butler didn't show any abnormal expression. "That's your freedom." As he discharged one wave after another of bliss, clearing away the remnants in his stomach, Klein washed his hands and returned to the hall. At that moment, he noticed that the old butler was no longer around. The one waiting outside was the maid with curly brown hair. "His Highness requested me to apologize to you. He still has matters to attend to and cannot wait for too long. Please go to Red Rose Manor tomorrow or the afternoon of the day after tomorrow." The maid bowed meticulously. "It hasn't even been 10 minutes, and I'd already done it as fast as I could. Usually, I can continue on for quite a while if I have newspapers." Klein smiled. "No problem." After receiving a response, the maid who had completed her mission immediately felt a weight off her chest. She giggled and said, "Detective Moriarty, you missed that lady again." Huh? Klein was at a loss. The maid lowered her voice and said, "This time, the young lady came with His Highness. She was the one who suggested taking a detour to meet you. In the end, I missed her because of my stomachache? Something isn't right." Klein frowned slightly. In a room padded with a thick and soft carpet, a quill that was being held came to a pause and stopped writing. In the open notebook beneath it, there were lines of text and marks of scribbled-out text. Scribbles, "Target attempted to escape control. But unfortunately, Detective Sherlock Moriarty leaves before she heads downstairs. Ellipsis. The target influenced the surrounding maids, but Prince Adesac's butler, Funkel, chanced upon the problem and dealt with it. Ellipsis. Scribbles, the target went off track once again. She participated in Talam's funeral on behalf of Prince Adesic. However, having quickly recovered to her normal state, she realized that she was unable to identify Sherlock Moriarty, and she could only let a chance slip. Ellipsis. Sherlock Moriarty went to Red Rose Manor to investigate, but the timing wasn't right, and the target happened to be riding horses on the golf course. Ellipsis. Scribbles, the target, once again, triumphed over the arrangement, encouraging Prince Adesic to visit Detective Sherlock Moriarty. Unfortunately, Sherlock Moriarty happened to have a stomachache, ended up staying in the bathroom for 7 minutes and 45 seconds, and the prince couldn't afford to wait. Ellipsis. His facial features were like a sculpture, but the middle-aged man who was blinded in one eye put down his quill and looked at a woman. What exactly did you put on her body? Breaking through the restrictions time and time again will create big problems. The woman laughed in a low voice and said, "It was just an accident. Don't worry, there won't be any problems." As she spoke, she pulled back her hair, revealing her long, white neck. After that, she slowly applied various things to her face, making her look even more alluring. Seeing that she was putting on her clothes and accessories, the dark golden-haired middle-aged man frowned and asked, "Where are you going?" The woman didn't directly answer and said with a smile, "Be careful of the quill in your hand, you almost exchanged bodies with someone the last time." "You don't need to remind me," the middle-aged man with deep blue eyes to the point of being black said with a straight face. The woman tightened her belt to make herself look thinner, then she lazily stretched and yawned while covering her mouth. I'm going to pay a visit to Mr. A of the Aurora Order. I hope he's as crazy as the rumors say. As she spoke, the expression of the blind middle-aged man suddenly sank. It was because that ordinary quill had begun to write on its own, as though an invisible hand was holding onto it. Above the gray fog, the ancient temple-like building stood quietly. After noticing some abnormalities in the series of coincidences, Klein entered the mysterious space after lunch, in an attempt to confirm a guess in his mind. He picked up a fountain pen he conjured, paused for 2 seconds, and then wrote, I am involved in a series of coincidences created by sealed artifact 008. Putting down the dark red pen, Klein held the silver chain in his left hand and began his divination. Finally, he opened his eyes and looked at the spirit pendulum just inches away from him. The topaz pendant stood still without any rotations. This meant that the divination had failed. Divination cannot be completed, possibly due to not fulfilling sufficient conditions, or it could be because 008 is resisting it. In both cases, a similar result would occur. Klein changed his statement and tried to direct it at different targets, but all of them failed. He tapped the edge of the long mottled table with his finger, hesitating on whether he should go to Red Rose Manor the day after tomorrow. If there's number 008 or a similar power to arrange these matters, then my sudden escape will definitely raise Prince Adesak's suspicion. No, my escape might not be successful. Prince Adesak's men live next door. Of course, since I'm already a faceless, it's easy for me to find a chance to escape when I'm out, but is there a need to go this far? Tomorrow afternoon, I'll be able to leave Backland without attracting too much attention by honestly seeking an audience with Prince Adesak and normally handing over the mission. His Highness will likely not force me, an unaffiliated Byander, to accomplish too difficult a task. If there really is a sealed artifact or demigod like 008 influencing the recent events, then from my past experience, I should just be a side character who mistakenly entered the stage and haven't received enough attention. In this case, escaping is tantamount to telling the other party that I have detected your presence. I'm highly problematic. In this way, relying on my faceless powers wouldn't necessarily allow me to escape the attention that has locked onto me. The best method would be to calmly go to the Red Rose Manor and go through the normal procedures to exit the stage. After graciously bowing from the curtain call, I'll fade away from the attention of the unknown party. After combining the two elements, Klein finally decided to pretend that he hadn't discovered anything and to leave Backland according to plan. Ellipsis. The bonfire in the campsite was burning with flames, and there was someone standing guard inside the campsite the entire time. Derek Berg leaned against a stone pillar and slept to recover his strength. At this moment, he was dreaming of the endless grayish-white fog, an ancient chair situated at the highest point in the center, as well as the indifferent figure sitting on that chair, overlooking everything. Mr. Fool. Derek said the name in a chanting manner in his mind. Following that, he heard the fool's voice. Prepare for the gathering. Yes, Mr. Fool. Derek answered silently and began counting his heartbeats. His eyes never opened, as if everything that had just happened was just a prelude to a dream. There's still quite a bit of time before we set off. There's enough time to attend the tarot gathering, he thought with relief. He originally imagined that he, who had joined the exploratory team, would miss this gathering. After 1,000 heartbeats, Derek waited a little longer before he felt himself entering that quiet and serene divine hall. The moment he opened his eyes, scenes flashed through his mind. It was as if an external force had instantly injected all his lost memories into his head once again. The scenes were crumbling city walls, buildings crisscrossed with white and blue, the temple of the fallen creator with a similar architectural style as the City of Silver, murals detailing the approaching apocalypse and the fallen creator's protection of the remaining humans from the 6 great evil gods, the beautiful and dangerous mushrooms, and Jack, the eerie pale yellow-haired boy of unknown origins. These kinds of scenes had repeated over and over again for a total of 5 times, but each time there was a slight difference in the details. The first time, outside the fallen creator's temple, all of the animal hide lanterns had been extinguished, nearly causing a tragedy. The second time, someone lost control of themselves and almost swallowed a mushroom. Fortunately, Chief Colin stopped them in time. The third time, the little boy, Jack, told a story, which was that he and his father had been searching for the Creator's holy residence in the endless ocean, and they ended up encountering a huge storm. The fourth time, Joshua was severely injured by Jack, who had mutated without any warning. The fifth time, the temple completely collapsed, blocking the exit of the underground area. And all of these occurrences ended with Demon Hunter Colin killing the little boy, Jack, and then started off with their rest in the camp, preparing to enter the ruined city. The beginning and end were connected as it repeated in a cycle. We've explored the temple 5 times. We have been living through this experience all this time, and there is no way to truly end it. The more Derek understood his sudden new memories, the more frightened and terrified he became. Audrey, who was sitting on the other side of the long bronze table, originally wanted to greet Mr. Fool and the others with a cheerful and light voice as usual. However, when she glanced over, she immediately noticed that little Sun's mood wasn't right. She immediately asked, "Mr. Sun, did something happen? Has the exploration of the true, fallen creator's temple not gone smoothly?" Derek seemed to have grabbed onto hope as he hurriedly described the rough situation once. When he was done, he said, "After that little boy was dealt with by His Excellency, we all closed our eyes and woke up in the campsite outside the city in preparation to begin a brand new exploration. We no longer had any memories from before. This process has been repeated 5 times, with only the details being slightly different. If it wasn't for Mr. Fool's alerting me to this, then I wouldn't have even known that I've been living a recurring life all this time." He took it for granted that the extra memories from his arrival above the grey fog were the result of Mr. Fool's reminder. He stood up and gave a solemn salute to the blurry figure seated at the head of the long bronze table. "I only understood the situation after listening to your description." Klein was still in a daze. He maintained his original posture and lightly nodded his head in response. In a situation where the reasons are unknown, a superior wouldn't so easily express his opinion, so I can't rashly open my mouth. Klein secretly reviewed what he had learned from his past life as a keyboard warrior. Seeing that Mr. Fool seemed to be an imperturbable ancient wall, Derek felt a lot more at ease and felt that the matter could finally be resolved. He turned to look at the Hanged Man, the world, Justice, and the magician, and he sincerely asked, "Do you know the root of the problem? How can this be resolved?" The zealous Audrey instinctively wanted to answer, but she found herself without a clue or even a guess. Furs was in a similar state as she was. Filled with rich knowledge from Earth and having read many novels of being stuck in the same day, Klein originally wanted to control the world to give out ideas to give everyone some inspiration to consider regarding the matter, but after thinking about it carefully, he chose to stay low-key and prepared to observe first. After listening to the Sun's description, Alger remained silent for a long time. At this moment, he said in a measured tone, "I can only think of 2 possibilities. First, you have encountered a nightmare or hallucinatory power at a level that exceeds a demigod. After regaining your memories with Mr. Fool's help, you should be able to immediately detect something amiss once you return to the real world. That way, the problem will easily be resolved. Second, you were forced to or you proactively entered a strange space or state at a particular node where time is controlled to flow in a certain manner, but the time is fixed within a certain range which is cyclical and the continuation is balanced. That is to say, it is relatively static. In this situation, there aren't many ways to end the cycle. Either there is an external force that can forcefully break the balance, or you find the key point that connects the distortion of time. An external force that can forcefully break the balance? Upon hearing this, Audrey, Furs, and Derek all subconsciously glanced at the calm and leisurely Mr. Fool sitting at the end of the long bronze table. "No, I can't always seek Mr. Fool's help. By not saying anything directly, he probably wishes to test my ability at dealing with such matters." After a moment of thought, he said, "Mr. Hanged Man, let's assume the second situation. In your opinion, what do you think is the key point that connects the distortion of time?" Without waiting for the Hanged Man to respond, Audrey guessed with interest, "That little boy Jack? You can't kill him when you're facing him?" Alger nodded. "That's a possibility." He hesitated for a moment before saying, "The Sun's description of Jack and his father reminds me of a particular incident." He turned to look at Miss Justice. "Didn't I once mention that I was pursuing a listener of the Aurora Order at sea? The goal for his voyage was to seek the true Creator's holy residence." Audrey carefully recalled and said without any strong confirmation, "That seems to be the case." Alger immediately said with a deep voice, "That listener also brought his son, and the son's age is very close to the son's description of Jack. Are you saying that Jack went from your world to the vicinity of the City of Silver?" Derek asked, stunned. After a short period of settling down, he inwardly felt an indescribable sense of happiness. This means that the City of Silver hasn't been completely sealed off yet. There's still a chance to connect with the normal world where the Hanged Man and Justice are from. I can only say that it is possible. The Hanged Man couldn't give an affirmative answer. He thought for a moment and suggested, "You can find a chance to bring up the Sonia Sea, the Loan Kingdom, and the port city in front of Jack. Perhaps there will be a different reaction, but of course, try to avoid doing so in front of the chief of your City of Silver as much as possible. Also, the key point doesn't necessarily lie with Jack. We have to consider other possibilities as well. You should tell us the specifics, such as the details of the mural, and maybe we can find something useful." At this point, Alger began to look forward to receiving information.